That's the question we want to find out from you. Let us know on our Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom, as well as on our Facebook page. But first, let's take a look at your news headlines. The Democratic Alliance's review of the NPA's decision in 2009 to drop corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma comes to the High Court in Pretoria today. A motion of no confidence against the president comes before Parliament this afternoon to be debated. And the Independent Electoral Commission will make an urgent appeal at the Constitutional Court for clarity on the Electoral Court. Now, these are some of your top stories this morning. But before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening on the sports front. A very good morning to you, Kendall.
Good morning, Elvis. Quite a lot happening on the sports front. Most of it in the boardroom, though. But let me not say too much before I greet our viewers. Good morning and welcome to Newsroom today. It's all work and no play for the Blitz Boxers. They hit Vegas running for the 5th leg of the World Series.
Well, 2026 is in 10 years from now, so it's fairly urgent, but there are still
a new FIFA President Gianni Infantino to open the bidding process for the 2026 World Cup soon. All this is Swedish track star and 1500-meter indoor world champion Abiba Aregawi suspended for doping. And that's what we have for you in the sports at about 10:20 or so. Be sure to stick around for that. Back to you, Elvis.
Thank you, Kendall. He will be back a little bit later, so you have to stay tuned for your sports news. Top story this morning. The presidency has defended as rational the 2009 decision by the then acting prosecution's boss, Mokotedi Mshe, to drop the corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma. This comes ahead of the DA's review of the NPA decision, which finally comes to the High Court in Pretoria today. Both the African National Congress and the NPA have declined to comment on the DA's review application. The recordings that have become known as the spy tapes allegedly reveal that former NPA head Bulelani Ngcuka and the Scorpions boss Leonard McCarthy colluded on the timing of the indictment to influence the outcome of the 2007 ANC elective conference. Now, that legal battle by the DA against the NPA's decision to drop the corruption charges against the president comes in the High Court today after more than 6 years. The DA says its review application to set aside the National Prosecuting Authority's dropping of the charges against the president is more relevant now than ever before. Joining us from the High Court in Pretoria is our reporter Mangoba Makunu, who's watching the proceedings there. Very good morning to you, Mangoba. I know it's very early, but can you maybe take us back a little while and remind us of the circumstances surrounding this case?
Well, certainly, Elvis, we're expecting a mighty legal battle here at the North Gauteng High Court as this issue of the spy tapes again rear its ugly head. We certainly know that this is a by the then former National Director of Public Prosecutions, Mokotedi Mshe, to drop all the charges, the 783 charges against President Zuma. Those were the charges of fraud and corruption and racketeering that were stemming from the arms deal. And certainly we vividly remember that announcement by Mshe back in 2009. He did mention the fact that there was some sort of political interference in this matter, and that indeed the charges had to be dropped at the time, saying that the timing also of the charges proved that indeed there was a political plot against President Jacob Zuma. Now we also remember the fact that Mshe did mention that the tapes themselves and the conversations that were contained in the tapes by the then NPA boss Bulelani Ngcuka and Neil McCarthy did show some sort of collusion in their part to try and reinstate those charges against President Jacob Zuma ahead of that 2007 ANC conference in Polokwane, and to try and sway the decision of that particular conference, and also to try and stop President Jacob Zuma, or to try and derail him from ascending to the presidency during the 2009 general election. So certainly this has been an issue that has been ongoing since 2009. The DA took it to the courts, and they've been fighting, first of all, to get access to the spy tapes. We know that that particular process happened last year, and now they're back again in court to try and and have this court review that decision by Mokotedi Mshe, saying that the decision was unjust and that it was irrational, and that they believe that it was unconstitutional and invalid. And they are hoping that this court will certainly review this decision with the hopes that it will be set aside. And what they are trying to gain from this whole process is that they want to see these 783 charges again being reinstated against President Jacob Zuma.
So what are some of the arguments that we are likely to hear today?
Well, we're expecting a fierce battle from all sides, especially from the NPA, which we're expecting to defend its 2009 decision. We know that, again, it might raise the issue that there was indeed political interference in this whole matter, and that it believes that it made a rational decision at the time and that its decision should stand in court. We're also expecting a fierce battle from the DA, which is likely to bring arguments that indeed there is no legal basis for the dropping of those charges, and that they were clearly political when they were dropped by Mshe. And it's also expected to argue that the quality of those charges was not at all affected by that decision by Mshe, and that these charges should be reinstated. We're also expecting the DA to also argue that indeed the decision by Mshe was not a just one, and that this court should then set it aside, and that this will now open the door for these charges to be reinstated. But then again, the president's lawyers will also be making representations. We're also expecting them to bring about arguments to the effect of supporting the NPA's arguments in court, to say that the charges were rational and that they should stay as they were made in 2009. We know that the presidency did also make a statement last night describing this legal challenge by the DA as an abuse of process by a political party, saying that indeed the DA here is just driving a political agenda in this issue. And this certainly does give us an indication as to the type of arguments that Zuma's lawyers will be advancing here in court today.
Ngoba, thank you so much for your time. Just briefly before you go, what time is the court case supposed to start?
Well, Elvis, we're expecting the proceedings to start at 10 o'clock here at the High Court, and we're expecting a full bench of judges to preside over the matter, which has been set down for the next 3 days.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's our reporter, Ngoba Mankunu, in the High Court in Pretoria, joining us there. Now, a motion of no confidence against President Jacob Zuma will be heard in Parliament this afternoon. The Democratic Alliance wants all 72 ministers and their deputies to refrain from voting, as they have a direct conflict of interest in the matter. The ANC has dismissed the call as unconstitutional. Well, it seems like we haven't got that clip. We'll come back to it a little bit later. Now, on Tuesday, Parliament passed the expropriation bill, which scraps the willing buyer, willing seller approach. Now, it still needs to go to the National Council of Provinces and then be signed into law by the President Jacob Zuma. And some opposition parties have criticized the bill, saying it was problematic and it opened the door for legal land grabs. Now, for more on the story, we are joined from Cape Town by the Deputy Minister of Public Works, Jeremy Cronin. Why did I say Germany? Minister Cronin, a very good morning to you and welcome.
Good morning, Elvis. Thank you.
First and foremostly, Minister, we're asking the question to our viewers this morning, but can you explain to us the need and the reason for the expropriation bill?
Well, basically, nearly 20 years ago, the wonderful democratic constitution was passed in South Africa, bringing about a non-racial constitutional dispensation for South Africa. And in the Bill of Rights, and specifically in Clause 25, which is the property clause, it speaks about expropriation. It addresses the legacy of South Africa, in which, as we all know, apartheid and before it, decades and centuries of colonialism have resulted in an incredibly inequitable reality in which access to property, to land, and so on is hugely distorted in our reality. And so the Bill of Rights in the Constitution introduces the notion of expropriation, not just for the normal reasons that any government would have, expropriating for a public purpose like building a dam or widening a road, but also expropriation in the public interest. And it says that it defines in the Constitution public interest as being for land reform, for instance, but also to ensure the equitable access for all South Africans to the natural resources of our country. But having said that, and correctly said that, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution also then says that any expropriation cannot be arbitrary. There must be compensation, and it must follow a law of general application. And so this bill, the expropriation bill, is an attempt to provide a general law of application to guide any expropriation in South Africa.
Mm-hmm. So it is expropriation with compensation?
Absolutely. The Constitution requires that. But also what the Constitution says is that in determining the amount of compensation, a number of factors should be borne in mind. The history of the acquisition of the property, its historical use, any previous government investments in that property, the current use of the property, the purpose for which it's being expropriated, and also market value. So the market value of the property is not the preeminent or sole criteria in determining compensation, but it could be one. But certainly some form of compensation is required in all cases of expropriation.
But what happened to those or landowners that does not want their land to be expropriated?
Well, you said in the intro that this replaces the willing seller, willing buyer approach. That's, the willing seller, willing buying approach has never been the policy of government in terms of land reform, for instance. The expropriation powers exist in numbers of government departments, including the Department of Land Reform. All municipalities, all premiers in provinces have expropriating powers. But what has not been in place has been a general law of application which prescribes a process that should be followed in cases of expropriating, regardless of whether it's a municipality or a province or a national minister that is doing the expropriation.
Mm-hmm. Now, there have been accusations that the bill could lead to land grabs. What measures will the department put in place or government put in place to ensure that this doesn't happen?
Well, that's exactly what this bill is about, is ensuring that there is not arbitrary deprivation. There hasn't been, I don't think, in South Africa since 1994. But at the same time, we do need to ensure that there is a much, much more equitable access to natural resources, including land. That's a constitutional imperative. It's not just the electoral mandate of the ANC government, for instance. It's a constitutional requirement that government presses ahead to ensure more equitable access for all South Africans. But it quite correctly says that this can't be, by way of a land grab. It can't be arbitrary. The processes need to be followed. And so this bill is very meticulous in describing a administratively just process that must be followed when proceeding with an expropriation.
Will the bill address the issue of land reform in the country, which have been maybe put on a back seat due to the willing seller, willing buyer principle?
Yes, I think that this bill is not just about land reform, but certainly I believe that it will give greater confidence to those responsible in government for land reform, and indeed confidence to land owners currently and to those who are landless. And to potential investors, because where there's a vacuum on uncertainty about how land reform should be approached, I think there's uncertainty all around, and I think that this bill provides a level of certainty. But the problem with a willing seller, willing buyer approach to land reform, not least in the South African reality, is that it results in acquiring perhaps a farm over here and then another in some other place. And so it's impossible to plan a sustainable land reform process, which typically requires not just expropriation if that's needed, but also the provision of appropriate infrastructure, perhaps for small farmers and so forth. Simply buying a farm here and a farm there for land reform processes doesn't really create the conditions in which a sustainable land reform process can be advanced.
There are those that indicate, Deputy Minister, that the bill creates uncertainty, especially to property owners and international investors. What do you say to that?
Well, I say it's exactly the opposite. This bill that, as you correctly said, was passed in the National Assembly and now goes to the National Council of Provinces. This bill has been in the making since at least 2013. And as the Department of Public Works, we've been very meticulous in taking it to NEDLAC. We've consulted very extensively with business, with the unions, with the community sector. The portfolio committee process in Parliament took the better part of a year last year. And although different sectors and different entities, the Banking Council, Agri-SA, have all got specific issues that they want to raise, overwhelmingly they are, have been supportive of the process and have noted that this does provide certainty and security. So that there's a clear instructions, and also the judiciary, by the way, who are also often required to pronounce on the legality or otherwise of an expropriation act. In the absence of a general law of application describing the administratively just processes that should be followed in the case of an expropriation, it's also been difficult for the judiciary to make clear decisions. So I think this helps to provide certainty to investors, to communities, to landowners, and to government.
So the bill is still open for interrogation, or does it only go to the National Council of Provinces and then the President signs off? How does it work?
Well, it goes to the National Council of Provinces, and they will seek provincial mandates in the process. Literally in half an hour's time, I'm going to the Select Committee of the National Council of Provinces to present what has now emerged from the National Assembly. Clearly, the National Council of Provinces will comment on the bill, and we are confident that before the end of the year, this long-delayed, actually, expropriation bill will be enacted by the President.
Deputy Minister Cronin, thank you so much for your time and joining us here in studio.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, there was the Deputy Minister of Public Works, Jeremy Cronin. Jeremy Cronin, can I get that right? Talking to us from our Cape Town studios on the expropriation bill. And there's, of course, a question that we pose to you. That question is on your screen right now. Looking at the expropriation bill, what do you understand and what do you make of the expropriation bill? Your understanding of the new land expropriation bill, please let us know if you are not clear on the matter. But we will discuss it because that's our theme for this morning, the expropriation bill. Let us know on the Facebook page as well as on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom. Now, opposition parties such as the Democratic Alliance are against the expropriation bill. The Democratic Alliance says that the bill has created uncertainty for property owners and that this would act as a deterrent to investment and further harm an already fragile economy. For more on this, we are now joined from our Cape Town studios by the Democratic Alliance MP, Anshin Dreyer. Ms. Dreyer, very good morning to you and welcome.
Good morning, Elvis. Nice to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming through. Now, the DA has been opposing the expropriation bill. What are some of the reasons that you put forward?
Elvis, our view, that's the DA's view, is simply that if there has to be expropriation, there has to be proper compensation. Now, just to expand a little bit, first of all, on expropriation, before I get to compensation, we must decide and we must know exactly what can be expropriated. Now, the definition as it stands currently in the bill simply says property is not limited to land. Now, in our view, the DA means this is far too wide. It leaves it wide open to abuse because it's not just land. What else, in other words, can then be included in expropriation? What can be expropriated? Does it include your shares, your pension funds, your property, your intellectual property rights? Does it include tangible, movable property like cattle, like other farming equipment, taxi fleets? So it's simply so wide open that everyone in South Africa could be at risk. Whether you're a commercial farmer, a developing farmer, or a taxi owner, you could be at risk. So we have problems with that definition. It's simply far too wide and it leaves it open to abuse. The second definition is that of expropriation itself. What exactly does expropriation mean? When is an act of government expropriation? Currently, the government can and does take custodianship of land and of natural resources of people, but it's not defined as expropriation. Therefore, when the government takes custodianship, it doesn't pay compensation. So as an owner, you may lose the rights and the enjoyment of your property without being compensated for it because it's not defined. as expropriation. So that is another huge loophole and a problem in the bill, which we believe must be put right. Then we get to compensation itself. The DA very firmly believes in just and equitable compensation, and that owners of land or any property that is expropriated must not suffer damage, financial loss because of that. Now, there's two problems as the bill currently stands with compensation, namely the amount of compensation and the timing of the compensation. The amount, it just says it must be just and equitable, but it doesn't mean or is not guaranteed that it will be market-related in the first instance, and it will not necessarily cover the bond that is still owing on the property that is being expropriated. So if the government expropriates land or your house, you could end up sitting with a loan, an outstanding loan to the bank. So you, without your house or without your farm, you've lost that, and you still have to pay an outstanding amount to the bank. So that leaves the expropriated owner in a very, very disadvantageous position. It also creates uncertainty for the banks, because if they're not sure that their loans are secure, that will affect the banking association or the banking institutions in South Africa.
Now, the Deputy Minister went to great length. In fact, you can carry on and I'll come back with my point.
Okay, the timing of compensation. The bill currently states that payment should take place no later than the date on which possession transfers from the expropriated owner to the expropriating authority. The DA, we in the DA are of the opinion that compensation should be paid much earlier on to the expropriated owner, so that you're in a position to find yourself alternative accommodation prior to the authority taking possession of your property. Otherwise, you don't have a house and you don't have the means to find alternative accommodation because they move in before you've received the compensation.
Now, the Deputy Minister went to great lengths to explain that expropriation does not mean expropriation without compensation. There will be compensation which is market-related, he added. But in this particular case, there are those that have opposed the willing buyer, willing seller, adding that it had frustrated land reform and property ownership in the country. What is your response to that?
Well, the government has the right to expropriate, even if you're not willing to sell your land. That's what the bill is all about, to take the land against your will if you don't want it. That is bad enough, and that creates trauma on its own. And that's why the DA stands so very, very firmly on compensation, and proper compensation, so that your bond, at least you can pay your bond off fully, and that you have enough money paid out to you to find alternative accommodation elsewhere in the same market. So compensation at the correct timing, early enough, so that you can find alternative accommodation, and sufficient compensation so that you can at least pay off any outstanding bonds. That is of crucial importance to the DA.
Ms. Anchandrea, now that the bill has been adopted by the National Assembly, it's going to the NCOP. What next for the DA on this matter?
Well, the DA members in the National Council of Provinces will make further recommendations to amend this bill and try and solve these critical the problems, the shortcomings in the bill as we see it. We're confident that we will be able to negotiate and get some of our proposals passed to make it a better bill. Elvis, but I must just add, while the ANC is actually trying to water down property and the right and the certainty of property ownership, the DA is actually trying to make sure that as many people as possible become owners, become landowners and homeowners. And we're doing that in places where we govern, like the city of Cape Town, where over the last 3 years we've transferred title deeds, over 14,000 title deeds to families who've lived in their homes for years. And in the foreseeable future, another 10,000 title deeds will be transferred to families who've been living in their homes for a very long time. So we want to ensure that as many people as possible become property owners, homeowners. That gives them something to use, security in the market, so that it becomes an economic asset to them. And we believe that will also stimulate the economy, which we desperately need. So the economy must grow in order for us to create jobs, which is the #1 issue in South Africa. So we need a growing economy that will create jobs. The only way we can get that is if that investors and property owners have certainty, have the confidence that their property is safe, that it won't be taken away at less than market value, and that if it is taken away, that they will be in a position to find alternative accommodation elsewhere. So we must ensure certainty and confidence in the market to stimulate the economy to create jobs.
Ms. Dreyer, what do you say to those that say that the land reform process in this country has been frustrated since 1994, and that in this particular case, the expropriation bill that the DA is probably protecting white monopoly capital? What would you say to that?
Not at all, not at all. In fact, I've just referred to the example in Cape Town where over 14,000 homes have been, title deeds have been transferred. These people who received the title deeds, none of them is white. They're all black South Africans, if we have to use racial classification. And we want to have many more, especially black South Africans, become property owners so that they can use their property as an economic tool to improve their situation in life.
Ms. Anshin Dreyer, thank you so much for your time and joining us in our Cape Town studios. That was the Democratic Alliance's Anshin Dreyer joining us there from Cape Town, MP there. Now, we're going to continue this discussion, and you can join in on the conversation this morning by letting us know what's on your mind on the Facebook page as well as on the Twitter handle. On the question that we pose to you, what is your understanding of the new land expropriation bill? You can send us your comments to it. SABC Newsroom, that's the Twitter handle, as well as like us on the Facebook page. If you like us there, you become part and parcel of this growing family. Let's take a look now at your comments. And this one here from Evan Mukwena that says, SABC Newsroom, the government need to intervene on the issue before it gets worse. Well, it's supposed to be worse, isn't it? Evan Mukwena there. Zibam Benze says, government must provide more leadership and not do crisis management. That's the one from Ziba. This one from Kulani says, the only solution to this problem is to give the students free education. Is that now land reform, or does that relate to the student protest? Well, it's probably to the student protest, isn't it? Can't be land reform or the expropriation bill. The only solution, he says, to this problem is to give the students free education. That's Kolani there on the Twitter handle, and you can do the same. Let us know what's on your mind on our question. Let's now take a look at some of the front pages on the newspapers from around the globe. We're starting off in Europe, and the Times reports that Greece is preparing to declare a state of emergency in parts of the country after violent clashes erupted yesterday between hundreds of migrants trapped on its territory and the Macedonian border guards blocking their path to Western Europe. And also at the bottom it says, live longer in healthy towns there. As you can see, Greece on fire there. Let's move on to New York. The New York International Times says that Japanese prosecutors indicted 3 former executives of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, the owner of the ruined Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, yesterday, charging them with criminal negligence for their role in the reactor meltdown after an earthquake and a tsunami 5 years ago. And then finally in China, the South China Morning Post reports that doctors successfully separated conjoined male twins in an operation that took 3.5 hours yesterday in southern China. Now, those are all the newspapers around the globe, and that's what we got for you here this morning. But we'll take a break, and we'll be right back after that. Stay tuned.
And I'm production Chetty Miller, SAB Miller, Anheuser-Busch InBev. It's something that I need to learn to say more often.
Will together produce around 1/3 of the world's beer.
It is a mouthful.
Have you ever considered skin bleaching?
Nigeria tops the list of African countries with 77% of its women bleaching their skin.
Now I can see that it is not good because it affects my face and some of my body parts. Thousands of Arab Israelis and Palestinians participated in a big rally.
Flight MH17 was shot down by a Russian-made missile.
How those chips may fall is a prediction best left to the currency of time.
That's Primetime News, Africa Journal, and Your World on SABC News. News Today takes an in-depth look on news locally, continentally, and globally. We bring the world to your home. We cover all economy news extensively to keep you informed. We are live to break news as and when they happen across the world. We analyze news using experts in all aspects. Make a date with News Today every Monday to Friday from 3 to 5:30 p.m.
Technology isn't all scary. There's also fun stuff like gaming.
Lots of women do play games, whether it's on their phones or their tablets.
Then there are Africans who are using new tools to make other people's lives much easier.
We typed the whole CV on a small, QWERTY Nokia phone.
For all these and other technology and social media news, join me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time on SABC News.
Welcome back. The Institute of Race Relations says that the expropriation bill is unconstitutional. The Institute says the bill again gives the state the power to take ownership and possession of property of virtually any kind by simply giving notice to the owner. Now, for more on the story, we joined in studio by Anthea Jeffrey, the head of policy at the Institute of Race Relations. Ms. Jeffrey, a very good morning to you and welcome.
Thank you.
First and foremostly, why do you say that the expropriation bill is unconstitutional?
Really, because of the process that it establishes. As the Deputy Minister was indicating, this is now a process which is going to apply to all expropriations by any number of state entities, including municipalities and so on. And there will be certainly preliminary steps that need to be followed. For example, that the municipality in Durban, for example, in the Pinetown area, there's a municipality that wants to get hold of land that's currently in customary ownership and use it for RDP housing. So it would have to negotiate with the holders of those customary plots and offer them an amount, say 80% of market value. And then if it couldn't reach agreement, it would give them a notice of intention to expropriate, to which they could respond with objections and comments. But the municipality is actually not obliged even to respond to what they say. It then can proceed to issue a notice of expropriation, and that will specify the date on which ownership will automatically pass to the state by operation of law. There's no time limit spelt out in the bill. The only time limit expressly referred to is the fact that the date of expropriation can't be the date before the notice is served. But it could, of course, be quite soon after it has been served, so people will have very little opportunity to prepare themselves. And secondly, the right to possess the property will also pass to the state on the date specified in the notice. And now, as regards compensation, the compensation will be based partially on the formula in the Constitution, which talks about market value and 4 discount factors, as they're often described, factors which are supposed to take away something from market value, such as the history of the acquisition of the property. But what you also need is for people to be able to get compensation for direct losses resulting from the expropriation, moving costs, for example, or if they have used the premises partly to earn money from a business, for the replacement of that income in the period when they don't have access to the property. But what happens is that now they face the loss of ownership, the loss of possession, and the bill says that in the case of a dispute, the municipality, say, must go to court. But then it's very unclear on whom the onus of proof lies, and the wording used suggests is that it will lie on the expropriated owner to say that the amount of compensation that's been offered is not enough. Yet, under the Constitution, we have a guarantee that there should not be expropriation unless certain requirements are met, including adequate compensation. And it's for the state to prove that those requirements have been met, not for the expropriated owner.
So are you suggesting
And if
then
you
that
want to contest the validity of the expropriation, to say, well, for the municipality to take land and customary ownership already held by black people in order to use it for RDP housing is not actually in the public interest as contemplated by the Constitution, there you will definitely have the onus of going to court with all the expense and difficulty that entails in order to try and prove that that your view is correct. Whereas, again, the state should have the onus of proving that if the right in the Bill of Rights is to have any meaning. So and then there's also, sorry, I'm going on, but there's also the situation that a definition of expropriation was put into the bill at the very last minute, so it was never discussed in NEDLAC or signed off by business or anyone else. And it talks about expropriation meaning compulsory acquisition by the state. And the implication is that if the state takes property not as owner but as custodian, then that definition will not be satisfied. So there will be a taking by the state, but it will not count as an expropriation, and so there will be no compensation whatsoever.
The Deputy Minister did indicate that there will be compensation, but are you suggesting then that the definition of market value is not fully explained or enough?
I'm suggesting that if you look at the Constitution, it says it must be just and equitable in all the circumstances, including the 5 it lists, the market value and the 4 discount factors. So there's no reason why we shouldn't also have in the bill a provision saying, and people should get compensation for direct losses flowing from the expropriation, such as moving costs. Because expropriation is such a drastic step that the people on whom it falls will suffer greatly. One thinks of those people with customary plots in the Pinetown area. If they get only something less than market value, it will be very difficult for them to buy something else. At the very least, they should have compensation for their direct losses.
The Institute of Race Relations last year indicated that the bill is going to make it much harder to build prosperity and overcome past disadvantages. Explain that concept for us. Why would that be the case?
Well, I think it's absolutely vital that there should be many more opportunities for people who are disadvantaged. But we can attain that much more easily in a rapidly growing economy in which many jobs are being generated. Instead, unfortunately, we have a stagnant economy, partly because of global factors, but also because of our own policy missteps and other problems such as ESCOM. And we have a very high and stubbornly high rate of unemployment in general and particularly among the youth. And then we come with an expropriation measure which does very much undermine property rights, which does create the risk of property being taken without compensation at all or without adequate compensation, which will reduce the prospects of investment and growth and jobs. And when the Minister talks also about the land reform issue, if I could come to that, it's obviously important that a great injustice should be rectified. Under the 1913 Land Act, black people were barred from purchasing land except with the consent of the state. And though there were about 3,000 land purchases that went through after that, that avenue was closed in 1936. You couldn't buy property anymore if you were an African. And then in the 1960s, we had the process of forced removals from black spots. This is an injustice. It must be rectified. But what the government is planning is not to take land and transfer it to a new class of black commercial farmers, but rather for the state to keep that land for itself. So it will amount to a process of creeping land nationalization. The more land is expropriated by the state, the more it is the state that will own it, and black farmers will be left merely with the possibility of leasehold, which they object to.
Now, we haven't got much time, but within 45 seconds, what would you propose to happen next?
I would say that we need to have a clear process, that where there's a dispute of expropriation, the municipality, the state must go to court. It must bear the onus of showing that the expropriation is fully in line with the Constitution. If anybody is going to be evicted from their home, the court must authorize that and look at the possibility of just and equitable compensation. Secondly, we must get rid of this definition and leave it to the courts to decide what expropriation should be. Thirdly, we should use the constitutional formula with its inclusivity and add compensation for direct losses. And fourth, we should say that the compensation must be paid before ownership is transferred, because we know that many state agencies fail to pay their bills in time. President Zuma has been battling to try and get them to pay within 30 days. A person who has a right to compensation loses their home, loses possession, and doesn't receive compensation for months will also be in a very poor situation. So the compensation should be paid before the transfer of ownership.
Ms. Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time and making it clear for us. That was Anthea Jeffrey, the Head of Policy at the Institute of Race Relations. Let's now take a look at some of the comments that we've received. Barclays has announced that it will be selling down its stake in Barclays Africa Group Limited, trading as ABSA in South Africa. Now, if you take a look at that, will that be the end of Barclays Safari, their African safari here in our country? Let's take a look at your comments. This one here from Born Cute says, Barclays Africa as Barclays PLC, it's a 62.3% stake in Barclays Africa, valued at 80 billion rand. So what will happen with the shares listed under it? Now, that's a good question there, Born Cute. Sure says Barclays stake in Barclays Africa represents a specific challenge or specific challenges to Barclays as owners, particularly from a regulatory capital perspective, says Shua Kumhanga. Arafat says, go withdraw your money in Barclays Bank before they close operations in Africa and giving their stake to new investors. You won't later cry foul. Now, that's a bit alarmist, Arafat. Gabriel says, Barclays selling its stake in Barclays Africa is very concerning. Now, these are some of your comments to us here on the Barclays issue. It is concerning that they'll be closing their operations here. But remember that Barclays ABSA or ABSA Barclays is a separate entity from that and independently. So I don't think it will harm your investments in ABSA. I can be mistaken, but let's hear it from you there out there. You can also let us know what's on your mind on the Twitter handle. But the question that we pose to you, what is your understanding of the new land expropriation bill? Send us your comments and views at SABC Newsroom, as well as on the Facebook page if you like us there. You become part and parcel of this growing family and post your comments. We'll take a short break on that sad note of Barclays leaving Africa, or Barclay Bunk, says some on the Twitter page. Let me know. We'll take a break.
As stories are broken around the world, SABC makes sure you do not miss out. As the stories unfold throughout the day, News at 8 updates all newsworthy stories worldwide. Globally, we are there. Locally, we leave no story untold. Make a date with News at 8 every Saturday and Sunday on SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome back. Now, land is a very emotive issue in South Africa, where most of it remains in white hands 22 years after the end of apartheid. Many commercial and small-scale farmers are currently facing tough times because of the worst drought in at least a century, they say. Now, for more on the expropriation land bill that we are still continuing as a theme today, we are now joined from our Cape Town studio by Annalise Crosby, who is the legal and policy advisor at Agri-SA. Very good morning to you, Annalise.
Good morning.
And also here in our Johannesburg studio, we're joined by Narius Moloto, the Pan-Africanist Congress Secretary General. A very good morning to you, Narius.
Good morning to you. Thank you for having me here.
Very good. Annalise, let's start off with you. The expropriation bill, what are some of your concerns around the bill?
Before I raise the specific concerns, I maybe need to say a little bit about the process. It has indeed, as the Deputy Minister said, been a very long process. And some of the concerns that we had initially as organised agriculture, and I was also part of the business delegation in NEDLAC, have been addressed through the process. The one main concern that we have at this point in time is the definition of expropriation that was also referred to by Antje Dreyer and Anthea Jeffrey. And that is indeed something that was not part of the original bill that was published for comment and that went through NETLAC. Neither was it part of the bill that was tabled in Parliament. So that came in during the Portfolio Committee process. Indeed, there is a concern that if you limit the definition of expropriation, there may be all sorts of government actions that regulate property and that have a negative impact on your property and your property value, but that may not necessarily be considered to be an expropriation and therefore compensated for. And then I think the other main concern is around the implementation, not so much the content of the bill, but how the compensation in the calculation of compensation will actually be done in practice, and what the role of market value and those other factors will be in that exercise.
Now, Mr. Moloto, you argue that the land should be taken without compensation. Why?
Look, first let me say that the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania welcome the land expropriation bill. We believe it is long overdue. Land is central for economic development, for social development. It's key. Now, we believe as the PAC that, look, the people who are the beneficiaries of this land expropriation should be the ordinary masses of our people who are landless, who are unemployed. Where are they going to get money to pay for this land? Now, on that basis, we said, look, whether the compensation and the amount is an issue that the government should address. But as a matter of fact, the reality of the situation in this country is that people in Soweto, at Evalon, they now have to dig the graves of the old and bury a person on top of his relative. While we have the vast, there's no justice there. Now, the issue, as PAC, we believe that at least the Parliament, for the first time, is beginning to discuss issues which are central to the needs of our people and interests of the majority of the people in this country.
Now, you want that explanation or the definition of expropriation better defined. What is the definition that you would like to see, Ms. Dreyer? Ms. Crosby, sorry, I beg your pardon.
Look, from where we stand, there should not be any definition inserted in the bill. There was no definition, as I said, in the version that was tabled in Parliament, because what you really want is you want to leave it open for the courts to interpret whether in a specific instance the state action is of such a nature and impacts in such a way on the rights of the individual that it actually amounts to expropriation and should be compensated for. So you should not only focus on the acquisition by the state, but you should actually allow the courts to look broader at what the impact is on the individual who is the victim of this expropriation.
Now, it also has been argued that the willing buyer, willing seller concept frustrated land reform for many years in this country, and that the new dispensation, the new expropriation bill, will make a difference. What do you say to that?
There is a lot of misconceptions about willing buyer, willing seller, about what has actually frustrated land reform in this country. I have personally been involved in this land sector and all the debates for 20 years now. And my honest opinion is that willing buyer, willing seller has very little to do with it. The land reform has not been making the kind of progress that everybody wanted to see because of, first of all, budgets being inadequate. If you go and look at the money that was allocated over the last 20 years to land reform, it's always been a very small portion of our budget. Implementation has really not been good. We could have been a lot further along with land reform had the implementation been better. There's corruption that's crept into the process that has pushed prices up in some instances. But that's not the result of the willing buyer, willing seller. If these processes had been better managed and the checks and balances implemented to ensure that there isn't corruption in the process, then we wouldn't have had this problem and we would have been able to redistribute a lot more land than what we had done to date.
Willing buyer, willing seller, Mr. Moloto, was that a deterrent?
Look, it will never work. It doesn't work. because our question as the PAC is that who has to buy? Now the masses, this appropriation bill is actually, we understand it must aimed at people who are landless. And the people who are landless, they are basically earning absolutely nothing. And if they earn very little. So from that calculation, clearly, it's not going to work that way. So you have to find a mechanism. At least we believe that there's a legal framework now that they could be able to discuss. Look, you can't also throw this thing to the court, because to the court it also boils down to monies who can afford more expensive legal teams to go and argue that case. That should not be left to those forums. It is a political issue. It is central to any country's development. It's like air. If you do not have land in your position, you cannot begin to do anything. So we do not believe that willing buyer, willing seller as a policy. Anyway, it has been the policy of this government for the last 22 years. It hasn't worked.
But don't you think that expropriating land without compensation will be unconstitutional for those who own the land?
We are not, those questions and those debates do not belong to the masses, to the people. They belong to Parliament. Let them sort it out there. They can be, we believe that there can be a framework within which the fact that there's a legislation, the same that a framework is on the table, they can basically discuss on what. Our understanding is that there will be an agreement in terms of the price, because I think the prices that were put on the land, it has been an impediment. Now, what guarantee that if that issue is not resolved as a problem, the people are going to... Yes, it has to be done in such a way that it does not frustrate the economy, does not destabilize the economy. But at the same time, we doubt if there will be an agreement between the landowners and the landless. And now, hence, we believe that if the land is in the custody of the government and is properly managed so that it can able to benefit the nation and the people, and our people, it will open the economy. It will make majority of the people that are excluded from the economy to begin to participate in the economy. And in that way, everybody in our country will benefit in the long run. So it's going to be a painful exercise, because it's not going to be like this. It's going to have a negative impact on some, but that is a short term. In a long term, we believe that the people of this country that are currently excluded will begin to participate. Our economy will grow, and there will be more participants.
Ms. Crosby, so as things stand, the only thing that you differ with the expropriation bill is the definition of expropriation. Is that the only thing that concerns you, or are there more?
That's our main concern at this point in time. And as I say, on the implementation side, to us it's important that when a case comes before the courts and the compensation is calculated, that it truly be just and equitable, and that things like the expenses and the financial losses that the owner suffers also be figured into that. But I need to say something around who pays for land reform, because I think nobody expects the poor to come up with the money. Land reform is something which is in the interest of the country as a whole, for the total community, and that's why we feel that an individual shouldn't be punished and victimized by taking their property without compensation or for less than market value for something that is in the benefit of the community as a whole. And Agri-SA has put a financing plan on the table now, where we're saying to government, if you were to come up with certain guarantees, with a guarantee fund and with interest subsidies, then private sector and government can work together to finance land reform and make it more affordable. So there are ways of going about this without expecting government to foot the full bill, or without expecting the poor to come up with the money for land reform.
Ms. Crosby, thank you so much for your time, as well as Mr. Narius Moloto here in studio. Thank you so much for joining me. That was Annalise Crosby, the Legal and Policy Advisor at Agri-SA, as well as Narius Moloto, the Pan-Africanist Congress Secretary General, SG, here in studio with us. Well, we'll take a break. We'll be back at the top of the hour. Do not touch that dial.
Controlesa is actually stirring the pot here.
I'm sure they've been consulted as Controlesa. They did not see a snake. Now that in certain areas there are certain benefits that might possibly be accruing, there is a snake, now we need to reverse the process.
I agree, but it is not above the sovereignty of the people. The very same court you're talking about.
The sovereignty of the people, probably you should explain that to me.
The sovereignty of the people is above everything.
It is not proper the way facts are presented to the public. Are you in contact with Khosekgolo Motshodi?
He was kicked out by the court because he wanted to be amicus curiae.
For your weekly dose of all things legal, join Dumile Mateza every Sunday at 2 p.m. only on SABC News Channel.
It's 10:00 hours Central Africa time on this Tuesday, the 1st of March 2016. This is Newsroom on SABC News Channel 404. Jumbo, Africa, and a very warm welcome to the second hour as we broadcast live from Auckland Park Studios in Johannesburg, South Africa, to the rest of the African continent. I'm Elvis Presley. I'll be with you until 12 o'clock. As you know, we also broadcast live on the YouTube channel. The entire show available on the YouTube channel. We're streaming there live, so you can watch us there too. We're asking you a question today, though. What is your understanding of the new land expropriation bill? You heard all the comments, you heard all the interviews. I want to know from you, what do you make of it? Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom and our Facebook page. Comment there, and we'll read it a little bit later. But first, your news headlines. The DA's review of the NPA's decision in 2009 to drop the corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma comes to the High Court in Pretoria today. A motion of no confidence against the president comes before Parliament this afternoon to be debated. And the Independent Electoral Commission will make an urgent appeal at the Constitutional Court for clarity on the Electoral Court. Those are some of the headlines that we have for you. But before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening on the sports front. Very good morning to you.
Elvis, good morning to you as well. Quite a lot happening on the sports front. Every single day there's something new to report on. And good morning to you. This is what we've got for you in the sports today. Let's box as they hit Vegas running for the 5th leg of the World Series.
Well, 2026 is in 10 years from now, so it's fairly urgent, but there are still...
And new FIFA president Gianni Infantino to open the bidding process for the 2026 World Cup soon. All this as Swedish track star and 1500-meter indoor world champion Abeba Aregawi suspended for doping. I'll also have you know I'll be chatting to Toby Badenhorst, the head of group sponsorship at Nedbank, about the Nedbank Cup coming up this weekend. Back to you, Elvis.
Thank you, Kendall. He will be back a little bit later. Top story this hour, the presidency has defended as rational the 2009 decision by the then acting prosecution's boss, Mokotedi Mshe, to drop the corruption charges against the president, Jacob Zuma. This comes ahead of the DA's review of the NPA decision, which finally comes to the High Court in Pretoria today. Both the African National Congress and the National Prosecuting Authority have declined to comment on the DA's review application. The recordings, known as the spy tapes, has allegedly revealed that the former NPA head, Bulelani Ngcuka, and the Scorpions boss, Leonard McCarthy, colluded on the timing of the indictment to influence the outcome of the 2007 ANC elective conference. Now, in a short while, we will be going live to the court as soon as we get that link up and running, so you have to stay tuned. You don't want to miss that. Meanwhile, the United Nations has confirmed that President Jacob Zuma and his French counterpart, François Hollande, will head a new high-level commission on the health, employment and economic growth. Earlier, the presidency released a statement announcing the appointments, preempting an official statement by the UN Secretariat in New York. The commission will focus on implementing post-2015 sustainable development agenda through growing health workforces in low to middle income countries and the question of inclusive economic growth globally.
The recent Ebola crisis in West Africa exposed vulnerable health systems and a critical shortage of health workers in poorer countries, shortcomings that stretch well beyond Africa.
We're still obviously waiting for an official announcement on our end, but what I can tell you is obviously the Secretary General is establishing this high-level Commission on Health, Employment, Economic Growth. I can confirm that it will be co-chaired by both President Zuma and President Hollande. It will also include three other vice chairs, Margaret Chan, Director of the WHO, the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, and Guy Ryder of the International Labour Organization.
The presidency believes that without necessary interventions, there will be a shortage of some 18 million health professionals in low and middle income countries by 2030.
The Commission is established within the framework and is a follow-on of the General Assembly resolution, which recognized that, I'll quote, investing in new health workforce employment opportunities may also add broader socioeconomic values to the economy and contribute to the implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Agenda. And the resolution requests that the Secretary General to explore steps to meet the global shortfall in trained health workers. So that's exactly what this commission will focus on. And obviously, Secretary General looks forward to the joint leadership of President Zuma and President Hollande.
Leaders representing both the global north and south.
The UN recognizes that a strong global health workforce will be critical to achieving health and broader development objectives, particularly around inclusive economic growth over the next 15 years. The Commission will be formally launched in France later in March and is expected to present its findings to the UN Secretary General by the year's end. Sherwin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Let's now cross live to the DA's review of the NPA's decision in 2009 to drop the corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma at the High Court in Pretoria.
We may proceed.
In the matter of democratic alliances, the 18 NEPP plus two others, that would be Jacob Zuma, the President, and Society of Protection of our Constitution, case number 19577 of 2009.
May it please the Court Justices, Mr. De Waal, Mr. Borgstrom, and Mr. Vakele and I appear for the applicants in this matter.
May it please the Court, I appear for the first and second respondents together with Mr. Manechi and Mrs. Platt.
I appear for the third respondent together with my learned friends Gabriel, Garni and Kumar.
As concluded, my Lord, I appear for the Society for the Protection of our Constitution with the amicus. Thank you.
Mr. Rosenberg, you may proceed.
Thank you, Justice Mutaba. We've prepared a chronology which we'd ask leave to hand in merely to facilitate the oral argument that we are going to be submitting. It contains a number of references which we think are important, but the purpose of it is to assist the flow of the argument and to prevent unnecessary referral to the record. Included in that chronology as well, on the last page, is a reference, a page reference to each of the volumes in question. So if there's a reference to a page, the court will, without undue inconvenience, be able to locate the volume in question. How many copies? And furthermore, we've prepared a copy of the main authorities that we are going to be referring to. We have a copy for the court, 3 copies for the court, which I beg leave to hand up as well. Justices, as far as the outline of the argument is concerned, it's going to be abbreviated and reformulated in one respect. Counsel for the National Prosecuting Authority has indicated to us that the National Prosecuting Authority is, in view of the provisions of Section 22(9) of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, not going to advance the proposition that the National Director of Public Prosecutions lacks the authority to institute a prosecution. And secondly, we've been advised by counsel for the National Prosecuting Authority that the authority's approach for the purposes of this case is going to be that the decision to prosecute, the 2007 decision to prosecute Mr. Zuma, was correctly to be categorized as a corporate decision. And in view of those indications, it has obvious implications for the arguments that we've put up on the heads of argument to the court, and in particular, the alternative argument that we put up as to non-compliance with Section 179(5)(d) of the Constitution. And depending upon the shape of the argument as it unfolds, it may be that we advance no submissions in that regard. Some preliminary background remarks for contextualization are necessary. The court will be well aware of the history of this matter, but nonetheless some brief remarks as to certain milestones in the matter which are important, and particularly so in view of the nature of the rationality challenge which is being advanced in this matter and which will be developed in due course. That rationality challenge is centrally predicated upon the contention that Mr. Moshe, the decision maker, part of the decision maker, well, in fact, the decision maker as far as the discontinuation is concerned, failed to take proper account of or failed to attach sufficient weight to the nature and circumstances of the corruption and related charges. Now, on the 19th of June 1999, Mr. Zuma became deputy president. On the 23rd of August 2003, the then national director, Mr. Nguku, held a press conference to announce that while a prima facie case existed against Mr. Zuma, he wouldn't be charged. However, Mr. Shabir Sheikh was to be charged, and we know that the latter's trial commenced in 2004, and that on the 2nd of June 2006, he was he was found guilty on charges of fraud and corruption with a sentence of 15 years. And it would appear to be common cause that that conviction had significant consequences for a potential prosecution of Mr. Zuma.
Mr. Rosenberg, we prefer that the third respondent should be referred to as President Zuma.
As the court pleases. The reference then was just in the sense that the third respondent at that stage wasn't the president, but of course I'll follow that. In the Sheikh prosecution, the state had alleged that over a period of some 5 years, from 1994 to 1999, substantial amounts of money had been paid by Mr. Sheikh and his companies to and behalf of President Zuma, and that this was done corruptly and with the object of influencing the president to use his name and political influence. On the 14th of June 2006, following those findings, the then president of the country, President Mbeki, dismissed President Zuma based upon the findings of the KwaZulu-Natal court that the relationship between President Zuma and Mr. Sheikh was unsavory. And this was followed up a week, in fact, on the 20th of June 2005, the decision of the then National Director of the National Prosecuting Authority, Mr. Picoli, to charge President Zuma was announced, and amongst the reasons for this fresh decision was the emergence of significant and weighty evidence which had emerged during the Sheikh trial and the facts which had been there established. And after President Zuma's appearance in the Durban Magistrates Court on the 29th of June 2005, the investigation continued and was broadened with a series of search warrants being obtained. The court will be aware that the obtaining of those search warrants led to a plethora of proceedings challenging the validity of the processes. That slowed down the progress of the investigators. In addition, the state had also applied to the KwaZulu-Natal High Court for a letter of request to the Attorney General of Mauritius. These proceedings led to the slowing down of the criminal charges, the prosecution thereof, and the court will have seen that 20th of September 2006, Msimang J refused the state's application for a postponement of the trial of Mr. Zuma, and the matter was struck off the roll. However, on the 8th of November 2007, the SCA handed down judgments in the appeals involving the search and seizure cases, in which the NPA was substantially successful. And we would submit that in the wake of that finding, the prosecution of President Zuma had, or against that background, the prosecution of President Zuma, which had become effectively inevitable after the Sheikh findings of mid-2005, had now been significantly strengthened by the additional information and documentation that had been obtained in the wake of the further proceedings. Now, against that backdrop, we need to turn to the reasons for the subsequent decision to discontinue the criminal proceedings. Before I do so, I'd like to make a few submissions in relation to the question of rationality as a basis of a legality review, that being the principal attack or basis for the attack on the decisions in question. The court will have seen from the submissions the applicant's reliance on the pharmaceutical decision. We have quoted the dictum from Chaskelson P. in that matter, where he said it is a requirement of the rule of law that the exercise of public power by the executive and other functionaries should not be arbitrary. Decisions must be rationally related to the purpose for which the power was given. Otherwise, they are in effect arbitrary and inconsistent with this requirement. And that traditional test or requirement for rationality, namely that the decision in question must be rationally related to the purpose for which the power was conferred, has been confirmed in any number of cases since then. In particular, we've referred to the decision of the Constitutional Court in the DA versus the President of 2013, 1248. That decision can conveniently be referred to as the Similani decision to identify it. The Constitutional Court has emphasized that there may be an overlap in the concepts of rationality and reasonableness. But at least on a conceptual level, one should continue to distinguish them. Of course, reasonableness as a concept in administrative law arises particularly in relation to Section 62H of PAJA, which postulates a relatively simple reasonableness test. Namely, the administrative action has got to be one, or it will be reviewable if it's one that a reasonable decision maker could not have reached. Formulation that we've encountered in Beto Star, decision referred to in our heads of argument. As indicated, rationality review is principally concerned with the relationship between means and ends. The relationship, the connection, the link, as it's variously referred to, between the means employed to achieve a particular purpose on the one hand and the purpose itself. And of course, the aim of the evaluation is not to consider the possibility of better means to achieve the purpose. It's to consider a rational relationship between the means and the purpose for which the power is concerned. And we're going to be returning to and emphasizing that the rationality requirement has got to be properly adhered to. There is content to the rationality requirement. It's frequently asserted by decision makers faced with a rationality review that the level of scrutiny in the context of the rationality test is so limited as to really, in fact, amount to little more than a formality. We assert to the contrary that in the light of the authorities that we referred to and this emphasis on a rational relationship, the means and ends, and the connection that must be established, that test as formulated must be carefully and properly applied to the exercise of any public power. The Court will be aware that the Constitutional Court has held on at least 3 occasions, we've referred to the authorities in our heads, that the principle of legality requires, of course, that in addition, the process by which the decision is reached must be rational. And related to that notion of procedural irrationality, the failure to consider relevant facts may render a decision irrational. That much was emphasized by the Constitutional Court in Similani, where it emphasized that if in the circumstances of a case there's a failure to take into account relevant material, that failure would constitute part of the means to achieve the purpose for which the power was concerned. And if that failure has an impact on the rationality of the entire process, then the final decision may be rendered irrational. And the final remark we would make in the context of irrationality is that, of course, the power mustn't be misconstrued. SAFU, paragraphs 27 makes, Similani, paragraph 27, and SAFU in paragraph 148 make that point. And against that background, perhaps then the appropriate starting point is the purpose of the power. The power that was exercised in this matter was a power conferred by Section 179 of the Constitution and conferred by the relevant provisions of the National Prosecuting Act, amongst others, to discontinue a prosecution. Section 21 of the National Prosecuting Act confers the power on the prosecuting authority to both institute and conduct criminal proceedings and to discontinue criminal proceedings. And of course, linked to that power is the power that we've referred to in terms of Section 179(5) of the Constitution, repeated in Section 22(2)(c) of the NPA, to review either a decision to prosecute or a decision not to prosecute. The NPA's prosecution policy has been referred to in the papers. The policy emphasizes, not surprisingly, the fundamental point that crime can't be allowed to undermine the constitutional democracy in South Africa, and hence the efforts of the prosecuting authority are directly addressed to reducing pervasive criminal activities. And that's taken from the prosecuting policy of the NPA. And it emphasizes that effective and swift prosecution is essential to the maintenance of law and order within a human rights culture. Offenders must know that they will be arrested, charged and detained where necessary, prosecuted, convicted and sentenced. So much for fundamental propositions with which nobody would have any argument as articulated in that prosecution policy. The final remark in that context is that effective and impartial prosecution of crimes is fundamental to a myriad of constitutional rights. In this matter, the court will be aware that the charges were charges that bore on allegations of corruption. The court will be aware that in the decision of Glenister, the 2011 decision of Glenister referred to in our heads, the citation is 2011-347, the then Chief Justice emphasized that corruption was a scourge that had to be rooted out of society. I'm not going to read the extracts from Glenister, and particularly dicta from Moseneke, Deputy Chief Justice, and Cameron, other than to just emphasize and recite one short paragraph, because it's in particular, and we'll be coming back to this, it's of particular importance in determining the role and significance of these particular charges and whether, in fact, the offence or conduct of Mr. McCarthy, as revealed in the tapes, was of such a character and more particularly linked or properly linked to these charges to warrant the prosecution on the charges in question being discontinued. And in that context, in Glenister too, Moseneke, Deputy Chief Justice, and Cameron J. said at paragraph 166 that there can be no gainsaying that corruption threatens to fell at the knees virtually everything we hold dear and precious in our hard-won constitutional order. It blatantly undermines the democratic ethos, the institutions of democracy, the rule of law, and the foundational values of our nascent constitutional project. And in paragraph 167, the court went further and emphasized as follows: this deleterious impact of corruption on societies and the pressing need to combat it concretely and effectively is widely recognized in public discourse. And closer to home, as it were, in the Sheikh appeal in the Supreme Court of Appeal, the appeal decision S.V. Sheikh, the court similarly pointed out that the seriousness of the offence of corruption cannot be overemphasized. It offends against the rule of law and the principles of good governance. It lowers the moral tone of a nation and it negatively affects development and promotion of human rights. So against that background, one turns to the reasons for the decision. And the reasons for the decision appear as Annexure JS10 at page 120 of what is referred to as Volume 1B. The court, and we apologize for that, there was a little bit of an unhappy preparation of aspects of the bundle. And in our practice note, we've indicated which volumes of the record have to be or ought to be considered by the court, and those ran from volumes 1 to 32, but the original founding affidavit and annexures was not included, and they were subsequently prepared in 2 volumes, one capital A and one capital B. And so for convenience, when I refer to volumes, I'll refer to volume A, volume B, and that's 1A, 1B, and I'll then refer to the volumes sequentially from one after that. So against that backdrop, one then turns to the statement by Mr. Masher of 6 April 2009, which appears at 120. The point that we submit must be borne in mind is that the NPA in its submissions accepts that the rationality of the decision must be assessed on the basis of the reasons furnished by Mr. Msher at his press conference at 6 April 2009. And the NPA in its submissions, and this also formulates or guides the submissions that we make, the NPA has said that inasmuch as the answering affidavit of Mr. Hofmeyr traversed a range of additional matters and material going to show possible political interference and conspiracies in other instances, this was done, I quote, only to provide context and background to the decision. And on that basis, which appeared to be common cause between the applicant and the NPA, that the reasons for the decision are to be located in JS10. And I'm not going to take the court through the authorities we referred to in our written submissions, going to when it is permissible to introduce additional reasons not relied upon in the original furnishing of the reasons to justify a decision, and when it's impermissible. The decision of Mr. Masher pivoted on what he referred to as the abuse of process doctrine. And in his submissions, in his reasons, Mr. Masher, page 121 of Volume B, refers to the fact the NPA had received representations, both oral and written, and that they dealt with the substantive merits, the fair trial defences, that's the second bullet point in the middle of the page, the practical implications and considerations of continued prosecution, and the policy aspects militating against prosecution. with regard to the first three issues, Mr. Mashef stated that he couldn't find anything with regard to those grounds that militated against a continuation of the prosecution, and hence they're not dealt with in any detail. He focused, as he stated, on the fourth ground, which he considered to be the most pertinent for the purposes of his decision. And at page 123, in this connection, Mr. Mshe introduced the concept of abuse of process. And he points out at page 123 that there are generally two categories of abuse of process. It may occur either A, because it will not be possible to give the accused a fair trial, or B, where it will offend one's sense of justice, integrity, and propriety to continue with the trial. And that much appears from the bottom half of page 123. Having referred to the so-called two general categories, which for the most part bear on the question of fair trial, he goes on to say that it's not only where fair trial is implicated, directly implicated, that the abuse of process doctrine or approach falls to be or may be applied. As he says at the foot of the page, fair trial, third line from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, fair trial is not the only test of abuse of process. Abuse of process may occur on its own, either because it will not be possible to give the accused a fair trial, or B, it will offend one's sense of justice, integrity, and propriety to continue with the trial of the accused in the particular case. Discontinuation is not a disciplinary process undertaken to express one's disapproval of abuse of process. It's an expression of one's sense of justice and propriety. And he goes on to quote from a number of decided cases in overseas jurisdictions. He quotes in particular the House of Lords decision in R versus Latif, as well as extracts from the British decisions of R v Martin and a decision reported in 1991, 3 All England reports of R versus Hui Chi Meng. And at 130, if I could ask the court to turn to that page, he concludes, and he says at the top of the page, it's against this broad principle of abuse of process that the conduct of Mr. McCarthy must be seen and tested. The question for close consideration is encapsulated in expressions such as so gravely wrong, gross neglect of the elementary principles of fairness, so unfair and wrong, and misusing and or manipulating the process of court. If the conduct can be so categorized, it would be unconscionable for the trial to continue. And he goes on to say in the 4th paragraph, in the present matter, the conduct consists in the timing of the charging of the accused. In general, there would be nothing wrong in timing the charging of an accused person, provided there's legitimate prosecutorial purpose for it, and the accused is aware, should be aware, or has been made aware of such purpose. It follows, therefore, that any timing of the charge of an accused person which is not aimed at serving a legitimate purpose is improper. And it's against, in that context that one concludes that fundamental to the decision of Mr. Moshe was his conclusion that the conduct of Mr. McCarthy offended his sense of what was right. It offended his sense of elementary principles of fairness. It was so unfair and wrong, to quote or to refer to the specific phrases that he used. It was so unfair and wrong that it should be discontinued. The prosecution should be discontinued. The first submission we'd make in this context is that the abuse of process doctrine is not one that's been directly addressed in our case law. But having said that, and if regard is made to the decisions referred to by Mr. Mshwe, the first point to be made is that those decisions involved circumstances under which a court, and for present purpose we don't suggest that a lot turns on it, but nonetheless they were decisions in which a court might order a prosecution to be stopped. And in the Hong Kong Appeal Court decision that we've referred to in our heads of argument at footnote 92, the Hong Kong Appeal Court decision of Lee Ming Ti, which referred to R.V. Latif and pointed out that it was generally accepted that it was only in exceptional circumstances that a stay will be granted where a fair trial is possible. And reference was made to a dictum in the Canadian court that a stay of proceedings is only appropriate in the clearest of cases, where the prejudice to the accused's right to make full answer and defense cannot be remedied, or where irreparable prejudice would be caused, and this is in a situation where fair trial is not implicated, where irreparable prejudice would be caused to the integrity of the judicial system if the prosecution were continued. And in paragraph 184 of Li Ming Ting, the court emphasized that the existence or otherwise of an abusive process was dependent upon the exercise of a judicial discretion, and as pointed out by Lord Steyn in Latif, this judicial discretion involves a weighing of countervailing considerations. It involves a weighing up, on the one hand, of considerations of policy and justice on the other.
Is that, I'm sorry to interrupt, is that in the case where it goes to a court?
Yes.
The court will then
yes.
weigh that. Yes.
And of course, to the extent it bears emphasizing, Mr. Moshe was approaching this basis on, or approaching this decision by employing the abuse of process doctrine to guide him, and relying particularly on Latif for the proper approach. And we made the point that for present purposes, we're not going to be emphasizing that this is a decision for a court. Not going to be saying, in this context, this is a decision which Mr. Moshe should never have made, he should have left over for a court. We make that submission in a slightly different context. But nonetheless, for present purposes, if, whether by a decision maker in the position of Mr. Moshe or in the context of a court, a consideration of whether there has been an abuse of process which warrants the discontinuation of a prosecution involves, and we would submit the reasons furnished by Mr. Moshe recognize this, involves essentially a two-stage test. It involves a determination of whether there has been an abuse. And moving on to the second inquiry, it involves a weighing up whether the nature of the abuse is of such a character, and we would say sufficiently linked to the prosecution in question to justify a stay of that prosecution and to justify, as it were, the policy considerations in favor of continued prosecution being overridden by considerations of what Lord Steyn referred to as considerations that he encapsulated as being relevant to the question of justice or fairness. For example, in Latif, Mr. Latif had been the victim of an elaborate entrapment process, without which he would never have entered Britain. And it was in the context of that elaborate entrapment process that Mr. Latif entered the country and carried out the crime for which he was charged. And in that matter, Lord Steyn concluded that notwithstanding the court's or notwithstanding the possible injustice as a result of the entrapment process, the public interest in ensuring the prosecution process continued outweighed that injustice. So, similarly, in another one of the decisions referred to in Mr. Mache's reasons, R versus Martin, I'm not going to take the court there, it's in our written bundle. Lord Clyde said, and this was quoted by Mr. Mache, Lord Clyde said, in relation to abuse of process, there must be something so gravely wrong to make it unconscionable that the trial should go forward, such as some fundamental disregard for basic human rights, some neglect of elementary principles of fairness. Again, we emphasize there is that link between the abuse and the question of fairness, breach of human rights. It doesn't, of course, go to the question of a fair trial itself, but in the context of the entrapment cases, it went to the means which were utilized, used and abused to bring that particular accused before the court. And similarly, a decision such as Bennett, the British decision of Bennett, which perhaps represents the high water mark of the abuse of process doctrine, one is dealing there with a case where the accused was, as a result of a misuse or manipulation of extradition procedures that the court found to be totally irregular. The accused in that case landed up before a British court, and that was a decision, unlike decisions such as Latif and Martin, that was a decision where the court found that that particular abuse, which had led to the accused unfairly and improperly being brought into the country, could not be tolerated. And that's a point that we submit as of fundamental importance in considering the nature of the abuse, and particularly the question of a connection between the abuse and the prosecution in question and the concomitant decision to discontinue the prosecution. Insofar as the question of use of process as a basis for discontinuing a prosecution may in some form have presented itself in our courts. We've referred to the dictum of Harms J.A. in NDPP versus Zuma.
Before you go to that, in the Bennett decision, what was the decision of the court? In the case of Bennett that you have just referred to.
In the case of Bennett, and that is referred to in the bundle of authority. I don't think that we managed to get those up to the court, unfortunately. Can we hand those up to you, Justices? That's decision 10.
Without going into the details, I just want to know, how did the court decide?
Yes, the court there concluded that the misuse of the extradition processes in question, and the background is usefully just set out in the head note, you needn't go there, it's 137, but that was the case where that abuse of process in those facts was considered to be sufficiently linked to the prosecution and to be of sufficient magnitude to outweigh policy considerations that prosecution should continue.
But that prosecution was linked, the abusive process was part of the case.
Yes. Yes. That's the link. Yes. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Yes. Bennett, there was no suggestion that Bennett wouldn't receive a fair trial. Over there, the means by which he had landed before the court.
They got the facts to get him before.
Yes. And what that may be contrasted with Latif, of course, where also the means utilised, the entrapment, to bring him into Britain, commit the crime, and hence to be arrested as part of an elaborate sting, were in that context held not to be sufficient to outweigh the public interest in prosecuting the crime. I was referring to the dictum of Harms J.A. in the Zuma case. In the President Zuma case. Yes. The case is to be found, and at item 4 of our bundle of authorities. I'm not going to take you there. You'll be well acquainted with the dictum in question. I'm just going to read briefly from one paragraph, paragraph 93 of the decision of Harms DP, and the court will be aware that this was the appeal against the decision of Nicholson J. in Natal in the matter that's been referred to as the 179-5 matter, where there was a challenge by President Zuma to the lawfulness of the decision to reinstitute to prosecute. And in the context of that challenge, which was essentially framed upon the basis that the decision to prosecute that was subject to the challenge effectively amounted to a review or reconsideration of Mr. Nguka's earlier decision not to prosecute, and hence Section 179(5) of the Constitution found application. and it being the contention on behalf of President Zuma that there had been a failure to comply with the requirements of Section 179(5)(d), in particular to take representations from President Zuma. And the court will be aware that in the judgment of Nicholson J. upholding that attack, there was reference to a political conspiracy, political interference, political motives perhaps for the prosecution. And in paragraph 37, in discussing the extent to which Nicholson J. had given credence to and to some extent taken into account in reaching his conclusion to set aside the decision to prosecute, to the extent that he had taken into account political or improper motives at play, Harms DP said the following. He said at paragraph 37, the Nicholson court, dealt at length with the non-contentious principle that the NPA must not be led by political considerations, and that ministerial responsibility of the NPA does not imply a right to interfere with a decision to prosecute. The court then said, well, that needs some contextualization. A prosecution is not wrongful merely because it's brought for an improper purpose. It will only be wrongful if, in addition, reasonable and probable grounds for prosecuting it are absent, something which was not alleged by President Zuma and which he went on to indicate can only be determined in certain circumstances. He did go on to say, Harms DP, that that doesn't mean that in all circumstances the question of ulterior purpose is irrelevant, and he cited an example where the use of powers conferred on a prosecuting authority may be unlawful if used for an ulterior purpose. And he referred to the decision of Highstead Entertainment, where in that matter the police had confiscated certain machines belonging to Highstead for the purpose of charging it with gambling offences. The police were intent on confiscating further machines. Harms DP pointed out that the object was not to use them for exhibits. They already had more than sufficient exhibits, but to put Highstead out of business. And he said in that context, the intended or the confiscation had nothing to do with the prosecution at all. And the power of confiscation in that case was misused or used for a purpose not authorized by the statute. So that was the power of, specifically, it was that confiscation that was set aside. We would submit that it is important to recognize the context in which Harms DP made his remarks. And that context, as I indicated, was one where the political interference was raised in one form or another on behalf of the third respondent, President Zuma, and which did find favour with the court below when upholding the application. And in that context, we say that what is required is that where a prosecution may or might have been influenced or driven by some improper purpose in the form of political interference, there's an additional requirement. Reasonable and proper grounds or probable grounds for prosecution have to be absent. And in our submission, in the context of an abuse of process approach adopted by Mr. Maché on the facts of this case, the NDPP case to which I've referred represents Supreme Court of Appeal authority that a court will not interfere with a decision to prosecute, even if improper purpose, ulterior purpose in the form of some political interference can be shown, unless reasonable and probable grounds for prosecution can be shown to be absent. That, in our submission, is what the NDPP case is authority for. And we make that proposition or submission particularly in the context in which Harms DP made his remarks. And against that consideration of those authorities, if one can return then to the rationality requirement and the evaluation of the relationship between means and ends, one's dealing, as I've indicated, with the exercise of a power to discontinue a prosecution. The end, presumably, is to address properly the abuse of process which had occurred. And we would start off by making the proposition that that abuse of process in no ways or in no material way affected the third respondent. And to the extent that it did affect the third respondent, particularly insofar as the question of delaying the service of the indictment until...
Sorry to interrupt you before you go to that aspect. The way I understand the papers is that the decision to discontinue was made on the 1st of April already.
Yes.
And so your argument, you are saying that we need to evaluate if that decision was made, proper consideration was taken in respect of the rationality of the decision.
Yes.
Okay. I follow. Continue.
The point I'm making is that one was to deal then with the exercise of the power to discontinue the prosecution. That was exercised, as you point out, Mr. Justice Ledwaba, on the 1st of April, with the end, the presumable end or intention of the exercise of the power to properly address the abuse of process. The discontinuation, the decision to discontinue the prosecution was taken because of the abuse of process. And the question is, well, if one was exercising the power to discontinue the prosecution for the purpose in some way of addressing and dealing with the abuse of process, it was because of the abuse of process that the discontinuation decision is taken. And it's there that one's looking for a rational link between the two. And the preliminary point that I made before, I'm going to turn now to say, well, let's analyze the abuse of process to see whether there is this link. The preliminary point...
Sorry again. In analyzing that abuse, I would like you to assist us in respect of the contents of the letter in D7.
The letter
it's a letter addressed. It's D7. It's a letter addressed to Haley and Associates And there's a signature there dated 30/3, and the date is March 2009.
30th of March 2009.
No, it just says March 2009.
Yes.
I think it's D7.
Yes.
When reading through the papers, this letter was a draft. It's a draft letter that was to be sent to Haley and Associates.
Yes.
And that letter deals to a certain extent in detail with the issue of the abuse of process.
Yes.
And at the end, after dealing with that aspect, it seems Mr. Mche and the team, in the last paragraph, they stated, I must inform you, therefore, that I'm unable to accede to your request to withdraw the charges against your client. I'd also like you to address me as to what weight can be put on the contents of this letter, because the decision that is reflected here contradicts contradicts the decision that was taken by Mr. Mche about 2 days thereafter, or so thereafter.
And we certainly will deal with that as we turn now to deal with the nature of the abuse.
Okay.
I made the general observation before turning to what was the abuse, to remark that the abuse for all affected purposes in no way affected the third respondent. And to the extent it did, it probably suited him in as much as, and this may be speculative, in as much as he...
Excuse me for a moment, it seems you've got a problem with the machine. Is the machine recording?
No.
Pardon? It's freezing. Can we continue, or do you need to get somebody to look at the machine? Fine. Is it okay now? Okay. Thank you. So sorry for the interruption. You may continue, Mr.
And to the extent that the question of the timing, or particularly the delay in service of the indictment, affected him at all, it very probably suited rather than prejudiced him. And it's in that context, and we'll be coming back to it, that we make the point that insofar as the abuse of process pivots in no small way on some form of injustice, unfairness, even if it's not fair trial implicated, that connection is absent in this case, and we'll return to that. And then the question arises, what is the abuse? It's said to be in political interference in the timing issue, as evidenced in the intercepted conversations between Mr. Nguka, former national director, and Mr. McCarthy, the head of the Directorate of Special Operations, the DSO. And we in our heads have divided that analysis up. We've said that, first of all, there is an inquiry into what happened over the period from 1 December 2007 up to 1 November 2007 up to 6 December 2007. The latter being the date upon which Mr. Mche advised Mr. Dana in a telephone conversation on that day that a decision had been taken not to announce the prosecution of President Zuma until after Polokwane. And if one has regard to what was occurring over this process, if one can turn to the chronology that we've prepared. One sees in the decision to prosecute President Zuma that on the 12th of November 2000, well, in fact, it's on the 1st of November 2007. This is shortly before the Supreme Court of Appeal decision in the search and seizure cases was to come out, but clearly in expectation of a favourable outcome, that on the 1st of November 2007, and I'm referring to item 10 in our chronology, if your justices have that in front of you, you will see that Mr. Moshe and his deputies met the prosecuting team to assess the readiness to proceed against President Zuma. And there was a decision, some discussion at that stage as to who should, in law or at least in form, take the decision to prosecute, and that appeared to be principally directed by the view that the NDPP should not take the decision, or formally take the decision to prosecute, because if later representations were to be made in terms of Section 179(5), to give that process proper respect and application, the National Director shouldn't have made that decision. And thereafter, on the 12th of November, there was a further meeting where Mr. Moshe met his deputies, and the question of postponing until after Polokwane didn't arise, and again it was a question of merely who was to take the decision to prosecute. And thereafter, on the 14th of November, item 18, there was a meeting to resolve the question of proceeding with the authorization of the racketeering charges under POCA. And on the 20th of November, item 20, the prosecution team submits an application for the centralization of charges. And on the 21st of November 2007, item 22, Mr. Downer and Mr. McCarthy agreed that the finalization of the indictment was to be left to the prosecuting team. On the 26th of November, Mr. Moshe and his deputies met, and that's item 23, to discuss the prosecution and the need to inform the minister. And on the 27th of November, item 25, Mr. Moshe met his deputies regarding outstanding aspects of the prosecution with a briefing from the prosecution team, and it appears that ultimately this briefing appears to have taken place, and it's common cause that effectively on the 29th of November at item 26, this represents the day in which the prosecution was finally approved. And on the papers, it's common cause that represents the day in which what is now recognized as a corporate decision to prosecute was taken. And the point that bears emphasizing, of course, if one has regard to the overall context of this, and particularly the meetings and steps to which we've been referring, there really was there was no real need for any consideration of whether to prosecute. That decision had been made in the wake of the decision of Squires in Natal in the Sheikh prosecution and the subsequent accumulation of evidence and documentation, and then fortified by the anticipated and then realized decision of the SCA in early November 2007 that material could be utilized. So really, in our submission, it appears that that case against the President had steadily increased in its strength and its potency. And by the time that these meetings took place in November 2007, it was a question of putting in place the steps taken to progress that prosecution. The poker charge, the authorization by Mr. Mashev, the poker charges, the finalization of the indictment, authorization for centralization, and the like. And
in your opening remarks, you did state that the first respondent, they now agree that the decision was a corporate decision.
Yes.
That's not an issue anymore.
Yes. I am referring to this and to this sequence of events to emphasize the point that one would ultimately have to assess the McCarthy conduct insofar as the timing is concerned with the whole question of the prosecution of President Zuma and whether, in fact, it bore any significant relationship to that process which culminated in the decision of 27 November. That's why I've taken the court through that.
I just asked the tax question was also then dealt with in November for the first time.
Yes.
With the poker
Yes,
application.
that's correct.
May I raise one question with you? On page B, 130, it seems that is the reasons.
Yes.
It seems Mr. Nche rests his decision of abuse solely on the question of the timing of the service of the indictment. Am I correct to say that? Or could there be other alleged conduct of McCarthy which, apart from the timing of the service?
Mr. Justice Motley, you're quite correct that at page 130, which is B130, Mr. Mshe's reasons, he states in terms that the conduct consists in the timing of the charging of the accused. And it's in that context that the NPA has accepted that in evaluating the rationality of that decision, one must accept that was what the conduct consisted of, and it was that reason as articulated in JS10 that must be evaluated.
I think it's appropriate time to adjourn for tea, and we'll resume at 11:30. Court adjourns.
Well, court has adjourned for tea, and we will keep you updated as soon as they return with the latest there, so you have to stay tuned. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after that.
Searching for the guy who steps up, way up, the queen of the pop and lock, and whatever this is, the party train conductor. All aboard! The answer is yes, you are that guy, and we salute you, party comrade. Join the movement online.
In Africa, technology has created many new ways of doing things.
ICT is an increasingly important part of everybody's life.
It's being used in education, for social media, and now for farming too.
The best thing about internet for a farmer is that we get to share information.
On Network, we give you all the important African technology and social media news. That's Network with Ms. Phumelele Zondi every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time, only on SABC News.
It's 11:19 Central African Time on Tuesday, the 1st of March 2016. This is Newsroom, your final hour on SABC News on Channel 404, Jumbo Africa, and a very warm welcome as we broadcast live from our Auckland Park Studios, Johannesburg, South Africa, to the rest of the African continent. I'm Elvis Preston. I'll be with you until 12 o'clock. You have to stay with us, and we're also broadcasting on our YouTube channel. You can go have a look at that particular channel there, the YouTube channel. It's streaming live. Our question for the day, we're asking you, what is your understanding of the new land expropriation bill? I'd like to know from you. Let us know on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom, as well as on our Facebook page. But first, let's take a look at your news headlines. The DA's review of the NPA's decision in 2009 to drop corruption charges against President Jacob Zuma is in the High Court in Pretoria today underway. A motion of no confidence against President Jacob Zuma comes before Parliament this afternoon to be debated. And the Independent Electoral Commission will make an urgent appeal to the Constitutional Court for clarity on the Electoral Court. Now, those are all your headlines. Our top story this morning. President Jacob Zuma says that the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan's job is safe. The presidency released a statement saying that Gordhan's job is not under threat and condemned reports that his job could be in jeopardy. The statement dismissed that there is a war between the two, but confirms what it calls difficulty in a relationship. The presidency says it was already dealing with the difficult relationship through correct legal prescripts. Now, this was before the State of the Nation address and the budget speech. However, it does not detail what these are. Meanwhile, the Hawks have denied that they are conducting an investigation against Gordhan for an alleged rogue unit that was set up at SARS when he was in charge. The investigative body says it has instead sent him 27 questions for clarity only. The Hawks said in the statement that the Finance Minister is not compelled to respond to these questions. Further afield now, the United Nations has confirmed that President Jacob Zuma and his French counterpart, François Hollande, will head a new high-level commission on health, employment and economic growth. Earlier, the presidency released a statement announcing the appointments, preempting an official statement by the UN Secretariat in New York. The Commission will focus on implementing post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda through growing health workforces in low to middle income countries, and the question of inclusive economic growth globally will be addressed.
The recent Ebola crisis in West Africa exposed vulnerable health systems and a critical shortage of health workers in poorer countries, shortcomings that stretch well beyond Africa.
We're still obviously waiting for an official announcement on our end, but what I can tell you is obviously the Secretary General is establishing this high-level Commission on Health, Employment, Economic Growth. I can confirm that it will be co-chaired by both President Zuma and President Hollande. It will also include three other vice chairs, Margaret Chan, Director of the WHO, the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, and Guy Ryder of the International Labour Organization.
The presidency believes that without necessary interventions, there will be a shortage of some 18 million health professionals in low and middle income countries by 2030.
The Commission is established within the framework and is a follow-on of the General Assembly resolution, which recognized that, I'll quote, investing in new health workforce employment opportunities may also add broader socioeconomic values to the economy and contribute to the implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Agenda. And the resolution requests that the Secretary General to explore steps to meet the global shortfall in trained health workers. So that's exactly what this Commission will focus on. And obviously, Secretary General looks forward to the joint leadership of President Zuma and President Hollande.
Leaders representing both the global north and south.
The UN recognizes that a strong global health workforce will be critical to achieving health and broader development objectives, particularly around inclusive economic growth over the next 15 years. The Commission will be formally launched in France later in March and is expected to present its findings to the UN Secretary General by the year's end. Sherwin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Global banking group Barclays has announced that it will be selling down its stake in Barclays Africa Group Limited, trading as ABSA in South Africa. It made the announcement in its financial report for the full year to December 2015. Barclays says it will be focusing its business on two core divisions, Barclays UK and Barclays Corporate and International. This is part of a new strategy. The group says Barclays Africa is a big risk for the company as it has little control over Barclays Africa's liquidity risks. Barclays is the major or the majority stakeholder in Barclays Africa, which trades as ABSA in South Africa with a 62.3% stake in the group. The Independent Electoral Commission is heading to the Constitutional Court. The IEC is appealing the Electoral Court ruling which led to the Commission postponing the by-elections last week in 4 provinces, including the Northwest. Meanwhile, the ANC says it will apply to be friends of the court during the IEC's appeal at the Constitutional Court.
The Electoral Court found that the IEC failed to comply with last year's Constitutional Court ruling. That judgment included that the voters' roll must have the addresses of voters. However, according to the IEC, more than 62% of the electorate don't have formal addresses.
Since the inception of the voters' roll in 1998, the Electoral Commission has held the view that disenfranchising a voter on the basis of a lack of a formal address would be unacceptable in a country where there are millions of people who live in informal settlements and in rural communities.
It is unclear how soon the Constitutional Court will be able to provide that clarity. However, that's not deterring the IEC from running the by-elections it postponed last week. What is clear is that the Tlokwe case will affect how the elections are run in the future, and it's a race against time. The municipal elections must be held by August the 16th.
There has never been a consideration to postpone the election. That question has never arisen, and it will not arise. We are confident that we'll be able to deal with all the issues that we're supposed to be dealing with, and we will then be able to deliver the elections within constitutionally stipulated period.
The IEC will host its first voter registration campaign this weekend. Aldrin Simpier, SABC News, Centurion.
And I'm Vabakshani Chetty Miller, SAB Miller, Anheuser-Busch InBev. It's something that I need to learn to say more often.
Will together produce around a third of the world's beer.
It is a mouthful. Have you ever considered skin bleaching?
Nigeria tops the list of African countries with 77% of its women bleaching their skin.
Now I can see that it is not good because it affects my face and some of my body parts.
Thousands of Arab Israelis and Palestinians participated in a big rally. Flight MH17 was shot down by a Russian-made missile.
How those chips may fall is a prediction best left to the currency of time.
That's Primetime News, Africa Journal, and Your World on SABC News.
Technology isn't all scary. There's also fun stuff like gaming.
Lots of women do play games, whether it's on their phones or their tablets.
Then there are Africans who are using new tools to make other people's lives much easier.
We typed the whole CV on a small, QWERTY Nokia phone.
For all these and other technology and social media news, join me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time on SABC News.
SABC News. We report, contextualize and present news and current affairs honestly, fairly and fully. We consider it a duty to provide consistent, relevant, useful and top-quality information and analysis. Our mission is to provide credible, accurate and interesting news programming, bringing news into everyone's homes in everyone's languages. Thank you, South Africa, for relying on SABC News for quality news output and for making us your #1 source of information. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Unemployment and poverty remain the biggest challenges facing Mpumalanga. The problems have been exacerbated by severe drought and ailing mining and the steel sector. Delivering his State of the Province address in Mbombela, Mpumalanga, the Premier David Mabuza called on the private sector to contribute in addressing challenges facing the province.
A colourful event featuring a display of the province's cultural diversity. But the state of the province, not so colourful. Unemployment rate remains high. About 74% of young people in the province are without jobs. Harsh economic conditions have worsened the situation. Hundreds of jobs have been lost in the mining and steel sectors.
In recent weeks, Honourable Speaker, the media spotlight has turned to Mpumalanga in the wake of the dreadful Lily Mine disaster in Bawet and the mass retrenchment of workers from Highveld Steel, which finally closed its doors.
To try and stimulate economic growth in the province, the Premier announced that more funds will be invested in agriculture and tourism. This to create much-needed job opportunities.
Among other key areas of government intervention, we'll continue to focus on improving economic growth and employment to ensure that we grow this economy and create the much-needed employment.
Despite all the challenges, the provincial government has made strides in delivering school infrastructure. A number of state-of-the-art boarding schools have been built to accommodate learners from farm schools. More focus will now be on improving delivery of healthcare services. The Premier has promised to invest millions of rands in building more health facilities, especially in rural areas. But opposition parties are not convinced, citing a lack of implementation.
The Premier's speech are still the same promises that he made every year. It is not something really new that can actually inspire people to say we are. Let's look at the issue of the school sanitation. I mean, last year we talked about the school sanitation, nothing happened. This year he's still talking about the hospitals. We still have this hospital, Bethal Hospital, Mapulani Hospital, that was spoken about in 2014, 15, in 2016, 17, nothing happens. But the most important thing is he's speaking about that the economy will grow by less than 1%. Now the issue, how do you create jobs if the economy is going to grow less than 1%?
From the past 7 years that he has been a premier, he has not said anything new, and it hasn't walked the talk. is always blowing his own trumpet, but in terms of the actual work on the ground is not there. That is proven by the lack of service delivery and the number of protests that you see around the province. The whole of Mbombela was pending last week, Tabachewu as well, because of lack of service delivery.
We expected the Premier to speak much about infrastructure development in terms of water and roads. The problem that we have is that in his previous speech, he mentions that project, but if you go now, you still find that we're lacking there and there. You still have water reticulation wherein there is no water, but water has been reticulated, especially in the villages that is mentioned in Bushbuck Ridge. You go to Zukno, there is a water reticulation there, but there is no water. So it does have more balance, but we will expect Premier to be hands-on, especially in terms of the implementation of the pronouncements.
The Premier also announced a number of bulk water infrastructure projects to be delivered mainly in areas severely affected by drought. Mabuza called on the private sector to work together with government in addressing some of the challenges facing the province. The provincial government is not looking only at local companies to uplift its economy, but international companies in countries like China and Italy have also shown interest in contributing to Mpumalanga's economy. Mwedi Masilela, SABC News in Mbombela.
KwaZulu-Natal's budget is to be cut by 1 billion rand in the first year of the medium-term expenditure framework because of the global and domestic economic downturn. Now, this was one of the announcements made by the KwaZulu-Natal Premier, Senzo Mchunu, in his State of the Province address. Mchunu also highlighted that unemployment, crime and slow land reform were some of the biggest challenges facing the province.
Address highlighted the successes but also the failures of the provincial administration. Despite the slow economic growth in the country, Mchunu said his government managed to increase employment by 6%, as reported in the last quarterly labour force survey. But he said levels of poverty, unemployment and inequality still remained high and persistent. Among the achievements listed were the rise in employment opportunities, the establishing of industrial zones crucial for economic growth, and the implementation of poverty intervention programs.
We have further increased employment by 6%. This has been achieved despite a lower than anticipated economic growth rate and the prevailing droughts in our province.
He also admitted that land reform was very slow, and so was the provision of housing.
We acknowledge the fact.
Well, that's where we've got to end it. Court is back, and now let's cross there live.
Mr. Mshe reported to Minister Mumanda in terms of Section 33 of the NPA. That report appears in D of the record, file D of the record at page 364. And at page 365, paragraph 5 of that report, Mr. Mshe says, we last reported that the only real obstacle to the decision on whether to recharge was the search warrant appeals. As these have now been determined in the SCA, no real obstacle to the decision remains. And in paragraph 6, it remains my view it would be unnecessary and undesirable to wait the outcome of any further appeal to the CC. And at page 367, D367, paragraph 7, Mr. Mshe says, in all the circumstances, I consider it's now appropriate that the decision to charge the suspects on the charges indicated below should be made as it has been. And page D369, paragraph 19 of the report, Mr. Mshe says the prosecution team gave a final briefing to the acting NDPP and the deputy and acting deputy NDPPs during a meeting of 29 November 2007. They confirmed their earlier recommendations concerning the prosecution of the third respondent and the two tint companies, paragraph 20, In accordance with all of the above, the investigating director, Directorate of Special Operations, Justice, as you will be aware, that is Mr. Mngwengwe, investigating director in the DSO, with effectively the position of a DPP. He formally took the decision. He signed the indictment, as you will be aware, and the memorandum or report to the Minister says, in accordance with the above, the investigating directorate, in consultation with the head DSO, me, that's Mr. Moshe, the other deputy and acting deputy NDPPs, and the prosecuting investigative team, has decided to institute proceedings against the third respondent. And thereafter, if we may return to the chronology that you have in front of you, you will see under item 30 of the chronology the decision to prosecute the third respondent, that on the 4th of December 2007, Mr. Moshe raised the possibility, or he spoke to Mr. Zuma, and he raised the possibility of postponing the announcement with Mr. Zuma, with Mr. Dana. And a helpful document in Record D is Mr. Dana's recapitulation of the events over this period by reference to his notes and his diary, which one sees at D57. It starts at D56, and he charts and records everything that happened over this period. And on the 4th of December 2007, you will see there at item 15 that Mr. Moshe raised the possibility of postponing the announcement with Mr. Dana, indicating what had still to be done. On the 5th of December, returning to the chronology, one knows that Mr. Moshe spoke to Minister Mabandla. One knows from subsequent documentation in the bundle that Minister Mabandla was concerned with the security and stability implications of serving the indictment on the third respondent prior to Polokwane. And we'd make the point that that's a legitimate concern. And it was a legitimate concern that a number of people had. And it bore no relation to political machinations or political manipulations. And although, for example, Mr. Dana emphasized in his memoranda that it should be solely a prosecutorial decision, and the kind of concern that the minister had, which was not directed towards advantaging any particular party, but was directed towards issues of stability and good order, even to that extent, as Mr. Dana contended, even with the best will in the world, it should be effectively a narrow prosecutorial decision. But we make the point that Minister Mabandla had that concern, and we know that she met with Mr. Moshe on the 5th of December. And on the 6th of December, turning to item 33 of our chronology, and also as reflected at D58, Mr. Downer's recapitulation, we know that Mr. Moshe spoke to Mr. Downer. And Mr. Downer's record of that reads as follows from D58. Mr. Masher, says there's a 90% possibility that he will decide to prosecute in accordance with the draft. Paragraph 16, D58. He says there's a 90% chance that he will decide to prosecute in accordance with the draft indictment. He'll only make the announcement next year. We can file a supplementary affidavit for the CC when this is done. Justices, you'll recall that there were those in the NPA who felt, certainly amongst the prosecution team, that it would assist, and for reasons which aren't altogether clear, but it would assist in the application for leave to appeal which President Zuma was making to the Constitutional Court in relation to the SCA's judgment on the search and seizure. It would assist in the answering affidavit of the NPA if it were able to say that we've proceeded, we've implemented, we've served the indictment, presumably to try and show some kind of reliance and implementation on what had been made available. It's not entirely clear why it was considered important, but for whatever reason, that appeared to be at some stage the prosecution team's motivation for trying to push through the service of the indictment. And on the 6th of December, returning to D58, as I said, Mr. Mashe indicated that in this connection, a supplementary affidavit for the Constitutional Court application could be filed next year. Mr. Dana records very frank and good-humoured discussion ensues. NDPP mentions that he does not wish to be seen to be interfering in the Polokwane process. He has taken account of President Beki's speech where the President called for calm and stability prior to Polokwane. The NDP consulted with the Minister the previous evening. The decision not to announce the decision to prosecute was his alone and no one else's. Mr. Dana informed Mr. Mashe that in his opinion this was an incorrect decision. Returning to the chronology, on the 7th of December 2007, item 36, Mr. McCarthy, who at that stage, as it appears from certain of the intercepted conversations, was on leave until the 10th of December 2007, Mr. McCarthy spoke to Mr. Dana and indicated that he hadn't been consulted on the decision to delay. The next step in the process is on the 14th of December, where Mr. Mshe signed the POCA authorization, and then centralization applications had to be dealt with, and one knows that the indictment itself still had to be finalized. It was ultimately checked by and approved by Mr. Mgwengwe some time later. Now, perhaps against that background, before turning to the conversations in question, if I could return you back to item 25 on the chronology of the decision to prosecute. On the 27th of November 2007, Mr. Mashe met his deputies regarding outstanding aspects of the Zuma prosecution, and one sees the minutes of that meeting at WH 56376, and it is of some importance. It's in volume 5, and if one turns to 376. Once these, that's volume 5, page 376, WH 56. These are Ms. Matska, who is in the office of who was in Mr. Michel's office, her notes of that meeting, and you'll see at page 376 there's a query from Mr. Dr. Ramaiti, at the 6th bullet point down, will they be ready in February? And if one has regard to the items that were raised, and we've summarized them, all the issues that were having to be considered and having to be completed, it appears that at this stage there must have been real uncertainty as to when, in fact, all of these steps could be done. The POCA authorization, the centralization of charges, the other aspects that are referred to here. It certainly would appear that whereas Advocate Breitenbach and Mr. Downer at some stage had met and had considered that the finalization of the indictment was doable by the 11th or the 12th of December, having regard both to the issues raised at this meeting as well as to the unfolding of the further steps thereafter, that it is not at all clear that despite the strategic goal of having the indictment served by the time the Constitutional Court papers were submitted, that could have been achieved. If we turn to the conversations that took place between Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Nguka, they span the period for November. First of all, one can have regard to the conversations over the period for November 2007 to 6 December, being the date upon which the decision to postpone service was taken. And those conversations appear in portion B of the record. I'm not going to take the court to each of those conversations. They're dealt with in our heads. I'm going to give a brief summary of what we believe those conversations over this first critical period indicate. The period up to 6 December 2007, when the decision was taken to postpone service of the indictment till after Polokwane. Now, there were 7 conversations over this period. 2 of those conversations were between Mr. McCarthy and businessman Mr. Mzwi Kumalo. 5 of those conversations were between Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Nguka. The first conversation was on the 7th of November 2007. One sees that in record B, page 3, if you wish to turn there. This was a conversation which related to a Business Day editorial of the 6th of November, and there is where the Business Day editorial speculated apparently as to the strategic pros and cons for the competing parties as to service or not of the indictment on the third respondent before Polokwane. Some references in that conversation to the man. It's speculated that that reference to the man was apparently Mr. Ronnie Casrels, who'd at some stage expressed a view that charging the third respondent before Polokwane would lead to chaos. The second of those 5 conversations, it's at B5, nothing of consequence was discussed in that conversation. The third conversation was on the 9th of November, B7. We've rehearsed each of these in our heads. I'm just going to go through them quite briefly.
So clearly, in respect of these conversations, there's a dispute as to exactly what do they mean between the applicant and the respondents.
Yes.
There's a dispute of fact.
Well, there's a dispute with respect as to interpretation. The conversations are what they are.
Dispute of interpretation,
yes.
rather. Yes.
Yes. So you can have regard to the conversation. You can read the conversations we have submitted in our heads of argument, and I am summarizing that now, that on any reasonable construction of these conversations, for example, that the second conversation, you can read it, I'm not going to take the court through it, nothing of significance relating to the timing was discussed.
Wouldn't the court be the appropriate forum to sort out this issue of interpretation?
Yes, of course. Of course.
Because we have read the conversation.
Yes. So I'm going to move through that quite quickly. My submission is that the second conversation, and this is in our heads, the second conversation contained nothing of significance. The third conversation of the 9th of November, there's a reference by Mr. Nguka to a possible appeal by President Zuma, but nothing else of any significance. The fourth conversation between these two parties, which you see at B10, Mr. McCarthy indicated he was on vacation at his apartment in Cape Town. There's some general reference to the results of the provincial nominations for the ANC presidency. There's possible reference to Mr. Nguka seeing President Mbeki. What there is in that third or fourth conversation is an indication. At the end of that conversation, Mr. McCarthy stated to Mr. Nguka that he'd taken or followed Mr. Nguka's advice up to Friday, but then he'd received a strong memorandum to say charge and get on with the matter. That appears from that conversation. This description of receiving a strong memorandum or indication from the prosecution team that they were going to charge and get on with the matter accords with Mr. Downer's suggestion to Mr. McCarthy when they spoke, and the approach that Mr. Downer adopted generally, that in fact there should be no delay. We know that, in fact, on the 12th of November 2007, Mr. McCarthy had spoken to Mr. Downer and had raised the possibility of delaying the prosecution until after the service of the indictment, until after Polokwane, and Mr. Downer had been quite firm in saying that that was not desirable, and that seemingly was the end of the matter. So, as far then as the fourth conversation of the 26th of November 2007 is concerned, that was communicated to Mr. Nguka. Of some significance is that Mr. Nguka, who on the version of the NPA was apparently pulling the strings and giving the instructions, didn't respond at all. He was told by Mr. McCarthy that the prosecution team had taken the view that the matter must just proceed without any delay. And Mr. Nguka didn't respond at all and said, no, well, come on, you can do better than that. The fifth conversation at this period was on the 6th of December 2007. And it was apparent that he was on leave still at this time and that he wasn't really involving himself in work aspects or work issues. So what can one make of these conversations? Perhaps one can draw the following conclusion. There's some indication that McCarthy may have initially followed the view, or been of the view, that the prosecution could be reinstated immediately. And Mr. Nguka may have been of the view that it would be desirable that at least the reinstitution shouldn't take place after Polokwane. It may be that when Mr. McCarthy approached Mr. Downer on the 11th of November, I think it was 2007, and it may be that, well, certainly when he did approach Mr. Downer on the 11th of November 2007, he was seemed to have been persuaded by the view that by the prosecution team that the criminal proceedings should continue immediately. And again, then, if one has regard to the conversations between Mr. Mshe and Mr. Downer between the 4th and the 6th of December, and has regard to the interaction between Mr. Mshe and the minister over that period, his meeting on the 5th of December, that Mr. Mshe was persuaded and made the decision that the service of an indictment should be held back. And it's not altogether clear to what extent Mr. McCarthy played a significant role in that. So much for the telephone conversations over this period. The telephone conversations which took place over the period 7 to 18 December 2007, there were 17 conversations that were transcribed in that period. We've dealt with them on the basis of themes, what broadly they addressed. We've made the point in our heads that the first theme that they dealt with was this question of when the NPA's papers in the Constitutional Court were going to be filed. The NPA were required to file by the 14th of August, December 2007. And what appears from these conversations at various points, Mr. Nguka sought to encourage the expedited filing of the answering papers in the Constitutional Court proceedings in the hope that these would somehow elicit some negative publicity for the third respondent. To the extent that Mr. McCarthy indicated some willingness to assist, really, if one has regard to what was actually happening, he had no ability to deliver at all or take that matter any further. One knows what was happening on the ground. The second theme is what we've referred to as McCarthy and the arrests at Polokwane. There's some indication in certain of the conversations that McCarthy suggested that in somewhat grandiose fashion that he felt like going to Polokwane and charging the third respondent there. We'd suggest that Mr. McCarthy would have known that he had no power to make good that threat. The third theme in these conversations is in connection with a supposed conversation that Mr. McCarthy had with the editor of the Mail and Guardian, Ms. Haffergy, the intimation being that this could have been at the behest of President Mbeki. In the papers, you'll see that Ms. Haffergy robustly denies Mr. McCarthy's account of the conversation. She says it's false and designed to bolster his own sense of self-importance and his sense of rubbing shoulders with important people. The fourth theme that emerges in the conversations over this period is that relating to an 8-page fax that we know was sent by Mr. McCarthy to Mr. Nguka on the 14th of December 2007. There's no indication from the record what this fax contained.
Yeah, you've dealt with that aspect in detail in your heads. Yes. You can just indicate to us what you think is.
Yes, I'm not going to take that any further. And the remaining themes was McCarthy and Mr. Davids' discussions regarding Mr. Hofmeyr and a possible meeting that was to be held by between Mr. McCarthy, or took place between Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Mbeki after Polokwane, which on the papers and according to Mr. Nguka, who was in his response, took place in relation to Mr. McCarthy's proposed departure to the World Bank. And the final group of conversations are those which are 13 conversations which were transcribed after the results in Polokwane were announced on the 18th of December. And for the most part, they related to expressions of disappointment at the outcome, whether it's Mr. Nguka, Mr. Kumalo or Mr. McCarthy. They related to the possible extrication by Mr. McCarthy from the NPA, and they related also finally to this meeting between Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Mbeki, which took place on the 21st of December. And the final conversation that requires any attention is the fairly lengthy conversation between Mr. McCarthy and Minister Mabandla on the 29th of December. And the main topic of that conversation, you'll be aware, was Minister Mabandla's proposed response to Mr. Zuma's support, President Zuma's supporters who were claiming a political conspiracy. So, in those circumstances, we make the submission that the nature of the conduct being the political interference in the timing of the service of the indictment was limited and insignificant, essentially. The extent to which there was political manipulation as represented in these intercepted phone calls is not particularly significant. To the extent that it took place, its actual influence on what happened is equally insignificant, or relatively insignificant, in the broader scheme of things. What we see is that at the end of the day, the service of the indictment was ultimately took place on the 28th of December 2007. It's not at all sure when this service would otherwise have, when this indictment would otherwise have been served, whether in fact it was possible and it would otherwise have been served prior to the 16th of December 2007, and it's also unclear the extent to which considerations relating to security and the concerns that Mr. Mshe and the Minister shared regarding service before Polokwane played in that decision. So, that being the case, in the context of a decision to prosecute, which had been developing for years as the prosecution strengthened and its potency increased as, for example, the SCA affirmed the search and seizure process, and as in the course of Mr. Sheikh's criminal trial, further evidence and material was produced. That decision was one which was taken over a period of time, and certainly in November and early December 2007, one was dealing only with the question of when the prosecuting team would be ready to serve that indictment. And if one were to accept that Mr. McCarthy's conduct in any way influenced, and accept it we can for present purposes on that assumption, if one were to accept that Mr. McCarthy's conduct in any way influenced Mr. Mshe's decision or the decision of the body to delay the service of prosecution, the service of indictment, it really was insignificant in the broader scheme of things. And that is why we made the point earlier, and we'll be dealing with it in more detail in a later section of these submissions. That's why we made the point earlier that the abuse of process cases are essentially dependent on and pivot on this concept of some fairness or injustice or breach of human rights or an accused's entitlement to fairness outside the fair trial procedure. And we've said that if one has regard to what happened here, the conduct in no way played any significant role as far as the third respondent's rights to fairness or his rights generally were concerned. The decision to discontinue the prosecution is what we must now turn to. And if one goes back to the chronology, one sees that under item 12 on the 10th of February 2009, written representations were received from the third respondent. On the 20th of February 2009, that was followed by oral representations that were made. On the 3rd of March, the prosecuting team prepared a memorandum to Mr. Mshe dealing with those written reps and the oral reps. That appears in the record at volume C, page 1, and it's important to perhaps then contextualize the letter which you referred us to, Mr. Justice Ledwaba, the letter to Mr. Halley, which I said I'd come back to, which appears at D7. On the 3rd of March 2009, the prosecuting team's memorandum appears at page C1 and following, and at At this stage, page 11 of that bundle, paragraph 10, the prosecution team recommended that the representation should be declined. This is, of course, before the transcripts had been presented to Mr. Hofmeyr and Mr. Miznyati. Paragraph 12, finally, the NPA must not discount the value of the forensic successes that it has achieved in this case, despite setbacks that at times have seemed insurmountable. The SCA and the CC have also gone to some trouble to appraise the issues in a sober fashion, and the NPA has emerged with merit. To accede to the representations in a summary manner would abandon all the ground won by the expense of extraordinary effort and resources, and with the approval of the highest courts in our country. A retreat for no good reason at this stage would not be explicable, understandable, or defensible. And it was in that context that the prosecution team prepared and recommended the dispatch of that draft letter to Mr. Halley, setting out why the representations should not be adhered to.
This memo by Downer was done a month before the decision was taken not to prosecute.
Yes. This is after, in relation to the written and oral reps of 10 and 20 February. Returning to our chronology, item 16 of the decision to discontinue, between the 6th and the 16th of March 2009, the third respondent's legal representatives presented Mr. Miznyati, who was at that stage the acting head of the DSO, and Mr. Hofmeyr with certain transcripts of intercepted conversations. On the 18th of March 2009, the NPA management team, and that's item 17, the NPA management team informed the prosecuting team of the nature of the oral representations, and it's agreed by everyone as to the merits of the case. And on the 20th of March 2009, the prosecution team prepared a memo to the NPA management, which one sees at C30. At that stage, at C28, in fact, at that stage, the prosecuting team had taken advice from Advocate Trengrove on the matter, and at C30 it deals with events which had taken place subsequent to that meeting on the 18th of March to which I've referred. And if you were to turn to C30 paragraph 8, it's recorded that Mr. Hofmeyr, together with Advocates Dana Steinberg-Beloy, met with Trengrove SC in Johannesburg on the afternoon of 18 March. Mr. Hofmeyr took Advocate Trengrove through the essence of the oral representations. The team members presented to him some of the considerations for and against acceding to the representations. We all expressed our sense of dismay, our dismay and sense of betrayal. Of course, at that stage, only Mr. Hofmeyr had listened to the representations. Paragraph 9, Advocate Trengrove advised that in essence the Mshe decision to prosecute lay at the heart of the fairness of the trial. If this remained defensible in that it was untainted by allegations of political conspiracy and based on evidence that is also so untainted, then the decision to prosecute should remain. And in paragraph 10 it appeared that advice to the same effect was obtained in a consultation between Mr. Dana and Advocate Breitenbach on the evening of the 18th of March, where Advocate Breitenbach advised that if the Mshe decision was untainted, this provided basis upon which the trial should continue, and he expressed more strongly his reservations about the relevance, legitimacy, and coherence of the allegations made in the oral representations. I in fact, understand that that letter was attached to that memo of the prosecuting team, the letter which appears at D7. Thereafter, between the 20th and the 24th of March 2009, the prosecuting team interviewed Mr. Nguka twice. He wanted to listen to the tapes, but wasn't permitted to. And on the 30th of March, there is a meeting between Mr. Mshe, his deputies, Mr. Mngwengwe, and the prosecuting team regarding the oral representation. The notes of that meeting appear, amongst other places, at Annexure WH1, page 331, which is at volume 4. Those are notes taken by Ms. Matske of that meeting, and there are also some helpful notes to which I will be referring, taken by Mr. Miznyati, which appear in volume C of the record at page 82. And if one has regard to what occurred at that meeting, it was agreed by all the parties that the merits of the case remained strong, that, and perhaps one could most usefully refer to Mr. Miznyati's notes in volume C of the record at page 82, where after discussing the response from Mr. Nguka, in the middle of the page, it's C82, Mr. Hofmeyr then went through a narration of the tapes that he and Mr. Miznyati had heard. There's plus minus 100 calls. C82.
In the middle.
Volume C of the record, page 82.
Yes.
Above, Justice McGraw, do you see the share Quo Vadis towards the foot of the page?
Yes.
Just above that.
Okay.
Note, Mr. Hofmeyr went through a narration of the tapes that had been heard. There were apparently 100 calls in 6 months. These are ugly tapes and more explicit. According to Mr. Hofmeyr, this showed apparently the mendacity of Mr. Nguka. Mr. Mshe apparently then said, well, or indicated what the way forward was. There was some concern regarding the utilization of the tapes that had been received, and he was unsure as to whether or not these should be followed up with the NIA, page C83, the third paragraph, the fourth bullet point. Moshe says he's not keen in following on the NIA tapes. Attaching a lot of weight on the NIA tapes would be perceived as having gone out of our way to assist JZ. And thereafter, towards the foot of the page, it appears that the prosecuting team were released, the deputies remained behind. Mr. Moshe indicated that by next Wednesday, the 1st of the 4th, 2009, we should make a decision. We'd point out it's not altogether clear why there was this pressure to make that decision by that date. The court will be aware that, in fact, for example, at one stage it was indicated in these conversations that it was important to get the input of both Mr. Nguka and Mr. McCarthy as to the inferences that could be drawn from these tapes, as to suggestions that were made at certain stages, that President Mbeki was also involved and was behind the curtain, to use the phraseology employed by Mr. Mshe in one stage, and so on. And the court will be aware that, in fact, it was only the day, I think it was the day after the decision was made, the 2nd of April 2009, that a request was sent to Mr. McCarthy to answer the list of questions that were presumably considered important and relevant to the exercise of the discretion. Mr. McCarthy had earlier responded to an earlier letter by indicating that he wished to have details of the dates of the conversations, I think to see the tapes and who the parties were concerned. On the face of it, reasonable responses, but it was in fact, as I say, only a day after the decision that a focused request in the form of 22 questions was sent to Mr. McCarthy. In any event, for whatever reason, Mr. Moshe felt pressure to make a decision, or felt it important to make a decision by Wednesday, the 1st of April. And over the page at C84, one sees it recording, and it does appear from the notes to which we refer, that Mr. Hofmeyr was the one who was arguing forcefully that one couldn't proceed. For the most part, if regard is had to these notes, it would appear that all the other parties broadly appeared to support the view of the prosecution team that the matter ought to and had to proceed. So that was the meeting of the 30th of March. It was on the 31st of March, item 29 of our chronology, that Mr. McCarthy responded, requesting more information regarding the intercepted communications. And on that day, the 31st of March 2009, item 30, it appears that Mr. Moshe, the deputies, and Mr. Ngwengwe met, and the meeting continued in the absence of the prosecuting team. Again, if one refers to Ms. Matska's notes at WH22, page 342, which again is volume 4. One sees that page 342 Mr. Magwenya was included in order to consult with him, and there was some general discussion of the question of ulterior motive jurisprudence and the impact of political manipulation in the light of a watertight case against Mr. Zuma, and it was agreed at that stage that although Mr. Mshe had seemingly been disinclined to listen to the tapes, he was going to listen to the tapes that evening. And listen to the tapes he did that evening, and on the 1st of April, he announced to the NPA management team his decision to withdraw the prosecution. And that meeting, it's an important meeting, obviously. One sees that, the minutes of that, or notes of that meeting, rather, taken by Ms. Matska at WH 25, page 345, volume 4. And also, if I could ask you to turn at the same time to Mr. Miznyati's notes of that, which are in B of the record 75. Notes for me. And perhaps we could start with Mr. Miznyati's notes at B75. In the middle of the page, Mr. Mshe, or perhaps if I could start at the top. Mr. Mshe said he'd received a response from Mr. McCarthy. He needs inter alia all the necessary and relevant facts in relation to the recordings, and he sets that out, and it's then recorded that the NPA had sent Mr. McCarthy the 25 questions. We know that they hadn't sent them at that stage, but they were obviously preparing to send them at that stage. We then went to visit the NIA last night. That would have been Mr. Mshe and his deputies. And Mr. Mshe says, after listening to the tapes, and I'm reading from the middle of the page of those notes, after listening to the tapes, he can't separate Leonard's involvement. He got angry. He can't go on with this case. He's decided to drop the charges. We just need to prepare the motivation, and how do we substantiate this decision? He says we have sufficient information to explain our decision. He goes on to say he has no doubt that the President may have been a player behind the curtains. He then goes on to the inferences that he draws about the involvement of the President. That refers to one of those conversations where Mr. Nguka had indicated to Mr. McCarthy, post-Polokwane, you're on your own. And the comments of various deputies are there reflected. The third bullet point from the foot of that page reflects Dr. Ramaiti saying that there must be a valid and sound basis, which he's not sure we have. This needs a little bit more research, a lot of research. And then over the page at B76, it's proposed that we only use the Hulley tapes and not the NI tapes. That's of no real relevance. Mr. Masher sort of agrees with me. And where's the Matska? The Matska tape. Thank you, Justice Ledwaba. If one turns to Ms. Matska's notes of that meeting at WH25, page 345, volume 4, she too records the response that had been received from Mr. McCarthy indicating what he required in order to respond more fully, and the option that's suggested by Mr. Hoffman is to provide a set of questions to him. And then at the top of page 346, Dr. Ramaiti says, or appears to have said, our approach is based on the manipulation. Are we suggesting that in the so-called manipulation is Mr. Nguka and Mr. McCarthy involved and no others? And the suggestion is, well, if we're going to draw an inference that this conspiracy or manipulation goes more widely, well, don't we have to request responses from the people involved, not only the presidents? We need to provide a very clear background. Yes. Mr. Masher seemed to vacillate in his approach. We've seen earlier in the notes of Mr. Mzanyati his suspicion that the President Mbeki, was behind the curtain. He then says, well, here at a later stage of this meeting, well, nowhere in the tapes we can't say anything with regard to the President. Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Nguka are the main players. And it's then said that by Mr. Mzanyati that this raises a very important issues. And if you are talking about manipulation, there must be some kind of clarity about who the manipulating parties are. And does it, in fact, mean that President, as he says here, President Mbeki and Minister Mabandla are implicated? And then at the foot of the page, Mr. Masher then says, well, I have no doubt that it might be a case of President Mbeki working behind the curtains. Over the page, at page 347, Dr. Ramaita, who kept sounding words of caution, said, we're trying to get the full story at face value. Mr. McCarthy abused the process. How and what way did he abuse the process? And if so, did he and Mr. Nguka act on a frolic of their own, as he put it? Mr. Masher at that point seemed to indicate, well, we should forward the questions to Mr. McCarthy with a timeline. There's discussion of the tapes then. So that was all the prelude, covered in slightly more detail than is covered in Mr. Mzanyati's note. This is all the prelude, and then a discussion of the tapes that had been listened to the previous evening. And then, if one can move forward to page 352, in an echo of what one sees recorded in Mr. Mzanyati's note, Mr. Mshe indicated that he listened to the tapes. I've come to the conclusion that whilst we were honestly working on this matter, I can't go on with the matter. Seriously decided to drop the charges. We need to work on the motivation. We need to look at the release and substantiate it. We have sufficient to say the process was influenced. I want to exclude the minister. I have no doubt he was moving behind the curtains. If one traces back that metaphor, that would appear to be the president. And then there is discussion of, well, if that is Mr. Mshe's decision, in principle, we get a the sixth last line, Mr. Mzanyati again emphasizes that the packaging of the reasons will be crucial. And Mr. Ramaiti repeats, you're going to need a firm and sound legal basis. You're more worried about the legal arenas and need a sound and firm legal basis. So that is what we have on the minutes of, or what occurred on the meeting of the 1st of April 2009. And we submit that what appears from this is that the decision of Mr. Mshe was an impulsive decision. It wasn't at that stage a reasoned decision. We would submit it wasn't at that stage a rational decision, backed by any reasons. It was a decision which reflected his own sense of betrayal and anger and outrage over the McCarthy conduct. We would submit that as at 1 April 2009, unreasoned and impulsive as it was not a rational decision. The reasons were worked out and developed. Or articulated and appeared in JS10, the press announcement of 1 April 2009. 6 April 2009.
A decision was taken, and thereafter reasons were put together.
Well,
do you understand it well?
Well, a decision was taken. In a sense, the reasons that were provided on the 6th of April represented Mr. Mshe's reasons. They hadn't been formulated or considered in any particular way on the 1st of April, other than we would submit that there was the sense of outrage and betrayal, and we say that the decision in those circumstances, made prior to consulting or getting further information from possibly involved parties such as Mr. McCarthy, was taken prematurely, it was taken impulsively, and if one then has regard to the reasons as developed, and they may be accepted to be the reasons lying behind that decision when an attempt was made to articulate the reasons for what had taken place, those reasons, in fact, buttress the submission that we've made. We've indicated that if one turns back to Annexure JS10, what one sees there is an emphasis on Mr. Mache's personal sense of outrage at what had occurred. He concluded that this amounted to an abuse of process. His reasoning in JS10 appeared to be that because of the sense of disquiet and the sense of disapproval that this conduct evoked in him and in any right-thinking person, presumably, it constituted or qualified as abuse of process. In the first instance, we say that that is not sufficient for the purpose of applying the doctrine or that concept of abuse of process. Returning to Latif, what was required of Mr. Mache was not merely to conclude that this conduct provoked a sense of outrage in him. What he had to turn his mind to was the second question, which he never did. And the second question is, did this abuse, or was this abuse of such a character that in weighing up policy versus justice, one had to conclude that this was such an egregious contravention of the rule of law or President Zuma's rights or fairness generally, that it warranted the discontinuation of the prosecution. We have indicated in our submissions that in the papers in this matter that the decision was fundamentally irrational. And why we say it was fundamentally irrational was, in the first instance, we say that in weighing up or in evaluating the abuse question, the decision maker had no regard or insufficient regard. We would, in fact, say had no regard.
Now, I still need to press you on this one. The record reflects that they met on the 30th, not so, to listen to the tape.
No,
I'm talking from their point. I'm not, just let's cut the other things.
They met on the 31st, and
on
they
the
listened
31st, to listen to the tape.
And they listened to the tapes that evening.
That was the day before he took the decision.
Yes.
Now, after listening to the tape, was there a discussion about their views concerning what they've just heard?
No. There's no
that?
record of that.
And they did not take a decision on the 31st?
Well, what we have is that the notes of the meeting of 1 April reflect clearly Mr. Mache indicating, I have taken a decision after listening to the tapes last night.
Was there any discussion of what they've heard in the tape? I take it the people who were at the meeting of the 31st listening to the tape were more or less the same people on the 1st, not so? Was there any occasion before he made the announcement or after he made the announcement where the views of other members were heard about the impressions on the content of the tape?
As we understand what is put up in the answering papers as buttressed by notes and minutes of meetings, there's no indication of Mr. Mache and his deputies caucusing and discussing and coming to a joint decision on that score. We have merely the record of the discussions on the 31st, no decision, and we have the record of what happened on the 1st, and there's clearly an indication of an announcement by Mr. Mashe to his deputies and everybody else that I have decided I can't go on. And the response there appears to be, yes, I've been referred to page 249 of the answering affidavit of Mr. Hofmeyr at page 200 and paragraph 268 to deal further with this point raised by Mr. Justice Mochley in paragraph 268. Page 249, volume 3. At page 2, paragraph 266, Mr. Hofmeyr says, until the evening of 31 March 2009, only Ms. Nyati and I had listened to the recordings. Once the NIA confirmed that we could make transcripts of the recordings, Mashe decided it was time for him and the deputies to listen to them too. This happened on the evening of 31 March 2008. On the following day, 1 April 2009, Mashe met with the deputies and with Mr. Mngwengwe. It is evident from the record of that meeting that he was disturbed by what he had heard on the tapes. Now, Mr. Hofmeyr would have been present there as well. And it's evident from the record of that meeting that he was disturbed by what he'd heard on the tapes until the night before, when he'd listened to the recordings before, he'd relied upon reports from Ms. Nyati and me to tell him what the recordings contained. He told, paragraph 268, he told us that listening to the records had made him angry. He informed us that he could not go on with the case and that he had decided to drop the charges, in other words, to discontinue the prosecution. Yes.
Mr. Rosenberg, but if you read that, it's clear that he says there it was my decision to discontinue.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Because that's how I understand it. I'm not
unambiguous.
Yes.
Do we have an affidavit from Mr. Mche specifically dealing with this aspect as to how the decision was taken?
We have an affidavit from Mr.
Other than the confirmatory affidavit?
Confirmatory, confirming this account.
But there's no confirmatory affidavit from the other NDP parties. Yes.
But for present purposes, the answering affidavit is clear and appears to speak fully in line with the documentation. 269, Mr. Mashe felt betrayed by Mr. McCarthy. Once he heard the recordings, he realized to the extent to which Mr. McCarthy had manipulated people, he felt. So, the sense of betrayal and outrage articulated and felt by Mr. Mashe led him to the conclusion that this was an abuse of process of a kind which warranted the discontinuation of the prosecution. We say that that decision was irrational for certain reasons. In the first instance, we've submitted it was irrational because, in fact, he failed to take into account or pay any consideration to the factors which indicate, or the policy considerations in support of a continuation of a corruption prosecution of this magnitude and kind in particular, which had as long and difficult and significant provenance as this prosecution had. And in that regard, we say that he failed to have any proper regard, if one formulates it in a slightly different way, but with relation to this exactly the same issue, he failed to have any regard to the second question in Latif, the balancing up between the policy consideration of continuing a prosecution like this as against considerations, particularly of fairness and justice, to the accused. And we say that considerations of fairness and justice to the accused really hardly entered into it, or certainly didn't enter into it to any material degree, regard being had to the nature of the conduct and the limited role that that conduct played in the process as a whole. If you compare that to the kind of abuse of process which had moved the court in Bennett to discontinue, but in fact, you compare it to the kind of abuse of process which, notwithstanding the egregious nature of the conduct and the extent to which it was criticized by the court in Latif, the entrapment and so on, had been held in cases like Martin or Bennett not to warrant the discontinuation of the proceedings.
Do the papers anywhere reflect any material prejudice if the case would proceed to the third respondent?
With respect, no. Justice Ledwaba, you will be aware, for example, that in Mr. Mache's reasons at JS 10, he made it clear that the representations from President Zuma had concentrated or referred to four aspects. The merits, the fair trial defences, the practical implications and considerations of the continued prosecution, and the policy aspects militating against prosecution. There's no implication that the fair trial defences were implicated in any way. To perhaps answer the question which you may be posing, Mr. Justice Ledwaba, in relation to any other unfairness in the sense of Latif or in the sense of Martin outside the fair trial, no. With respect, there's no indication of any unfairness at all or prejudice that may have been sustained by what, in the nature of things, was ultimately a relatively short delay in service of the indictment. I've made that point already, having regard to the time frames concerned. And in those circumstances, if anything, we've made the point, certainly in relation to holding the service over till after Polokwane, it probably suited the third respondent rather than prejudiced him.
As a follow-up to your question by my brother here, was there anything or is there anything on the papers which indicate that the conduct of Mrs. McCarthy and Mrs. Nuka tainted the evidence uncovered by KPMG in any way?
No. Nobody suggests that, other than the timing, that the case against the third respondent was implicated, affected, or contaminated in any way. Those are our submissions on the question of rationality. I've got a handful of more abbreviated submissions I wish to make. If I could make them after lunch, I want to see if I can cut short the submissions in the light of the indications from the NPA as to the concessions or the approach that they may take. The submissions I was going to make may in fact be significantly shortened.
I think then this would be the appropriate time to adjourn. The court will adjourn and will resume at 2 o'clock.
The public protector Tilima Donsela had a tough time motivating for